Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, a quiet place where curiosity is allowed to slow down, where large ideas are handled gently, and where history is not rushed toward conclusions. Tonight, we settle into the shadow of one of the most familiar stone figures on Earth, a monument that has appeared on postcards, textbooks, documentaries, and dreams for generations, yet still manages to feel slightly out of place every time we truly look at it. The Great Sphinx stands as if it has been waiting, not performing, not announcing itself, simply present, unmoved by how often it has been explained away. This is not a story that begins with certainty or ends with resolution. It begins with attention, with stillness, with the quiet realization that some things persist not because they are understood, but because they endure. The Sphinx is often introduced as a solved object, a guardian carved for a pharaoh, a symbol of royal authority, a familiar companion to the pyramids rising nearby. It is usually framed as a supporting character in a larger story about dynasties, gods, and monumental ambition. Yet when the noise fades, when the labels fall away, the Sphinx remains an object that does not entirely cooperate with its assigned role. Its body does not quite match its head. Its surface carries scars that feel misplaced in a desert landscape. Its silence feels older than the words used to describe it. Even surrounded by explanations, it keeps its distance. If you find this space calming, or if you enjoy letting slow ideas unfold without being pushed towards certainty, you are welcome to stay a while. A like or a subscription helps this quiet corner continue, reaching others who appreciate unhurried thinking and gentle curiosity. There is no urgency here, only time moving at its own pace. Now, let us ease into the presence of the Sphinx itself, not as an answer, but as an object that invites patience. It rises from the Giza plateau with the body of a lion and the face of a king, though even that description already assumes more than the stone itself confirms. It is immense without being tall, grounded rather than towering, stretched horizontally across the limestone bedrock as though it grew from the ground instead of being imposed upon it. Unlike the pyramids, which draw the eye upward toward the sky, the Sphinx holds the gaze at ground level. It does not point toward the heavens, it watches the horizon. For centuries, travellers stood before it with a sense of quiet unease. Not fear, but dissonance. The feeling that something is being observed rather than presented. Ancient Greek visitors wrote of it as already ancient in their own time. Roman writers treated it as a relic from an age beyond memory. Medieval travellers half buried it in myth and sand, unsure how to place it within their understanding of history. It was always there and yet never quite anchored to the moment in which it was being viewed. Modern archaeology attempted to give the Sphinx a firm birth date, situating it within the reign of a specific pharaoh, assigning it a role within a known dynastic framework. This effort was not careless or malicious. It followed the logic of archaeology as a discipline that depends on context, continuity, and material culture. Stones are dated by association. Monuments are explained through inscriptions, surrounding structures, and historical records. Yet the Sphinx resists this method in subtle ways. It bears no original inscription describing its creation. It offers no clear dedication text. It does not name its builder in stone, as Egyptian monuments so often do. Instead, it sits in silence, leaving historians to infer rather than read. The commonly accepted story places the Sphinx within the 4th dynasty, attributing it to Pharaoh Khafre, whose pyramid stands nearby. The logic seems straightforward. The Sphinx sits within the same complex. The facial features are said to resemble statues of Khafre. The causeway aligns in a way that suggests intentional design. On paper, the pieces fit. Yet fitting pieces together does not always mean they belong to the same puzzle. Sometimes proximity creates assumptions that feel solid, only because they are repeated often enough. When the Sphinx is examined not as a symbol, but as a physical object, questions emerge quietly, without demanding attention. The body shows signs of erosion that appear inconsistent with prolonged exposure to wind-driven sand alone. The grooves and channels carved into its limestone flanks resemble patterns typically associated with heavy rainfall, water running down vertical surfaces over long periods of time. This is not a fringe observation whispered at the edges of scholarship. It has been noted, debated and measured by geologists who specialise in weathering processes. Their observations do not claim certainty, only incompatibility. The climate required to produce such erosion does not align neatly with the arid conditions of dynastic Egypt. This detail alone does not rewrite history. Stones can be deceptive. Environments change. Restoration alters surfaces. Yet taken together with other inconsistencies, it begins to soften the edges of the accepted timeline. The Sphinx does not loudly proclaim itself older. It simply fails to behave exactly as expected for something carved when Egypt was already fully formed. The head, too, raises quiet concerns. Compared to the massive body, it appears small, almost compressed, as though reduced from an earlier, larger form. Some have suggested it was recarved, reshaped at a later time to bear the likeness of a pharaoh. This idea is neither provable nor dismissible with ease. Stone remembers its past shapes imperfectly, but proportions speak. Egyptian sculptors were masters of balance, deeply attentive to harmony and symbolism. A mismatch of this magnitude feels uncharacteristic, unless alteration occurred across vastly different periods, by hands separated not only by intention, but by culture. Then there is the question of orientation. The Sphinx faces due east, aligned with the rising sun. This alignment is often presented as evidence of solar worship tied to later dynastic theology. Yet solar observation predates Egypt as a political entity. Long before kings ruled the Nile, humans across the world tracked the sun's movement with stone, wood, and memory. Orientation toward the east does not belong to Egypt alone. It belongs to timekeeping cultures that measured life by light and season, rather than by throne and title. If the Sphinx were built before Egypt existed as a unified civilization, it would not mean that Egyptians were unaware of it. On the contrary, it would suggest inheritance, adoption, restoration rather than creation. Early Egyptian culture was deeply respectful of what came before. They repaired monuments, they reinscribed older structures, they absorbed symbols into new religious frameworks without erasing their origins. Continuity mattered. Memory mattered. The idea that Egyptians encountered an already ancient structure and incorporated it into their worldview fits comfortably within what is known about their relationship with the past. This possibility changes the tone of the Sphinx entirely. It becomes less a royal monument and more a boundary marker between epochs, a reminder that civilization does not begin from nothing, but gathers itself around what endures. Stone becomes a form of memory when writing has not yet arrived. A structure carved deeply enough into bedrock becomes a message that does not require language. The Giza plateau itself supports this quieter interpretation. It is not a blank canvas. It is a landscape layered with human activity stretching back further than dynastic records fully capture. Excavations reveal earlier occupation phases, tool marks from periods not well represented in written history, subtle indications that the plateau held meaning before pyramids defined it. Sacred landscapes often outlast the cultures that first named them. They persist because something about them invites return. None of this demands a lost super-civilization or impossible technologies. The idea that complex societies existed before recorded history is not extraordinary. It is expected. Writing is recent compared to humanity itself. Stoneworking predates kingship. Astronomy predates agriculture. Memory was preserved through repetition, oral tradition, and placement in the landscape long before it was preserved in ink. The Sphinx, viewed through this lens, becomes quieter rather than more sensational. It does not shout secrets. It does not promise revelations. It simply occupies a longer stretch of time than it is usually granted. It becomes a witness rather than a declaration. a presence that outlasted climate shifts, cultural transformations and political reinvention. As dynastic Egypt emerged, organised and named itself, the Sphinx may have already been old, not ruined, not forgotten, but present. It may have been repaired, refaced, reinterpreted, and integrated into a worldview that valued cosmic order and ancestral continuity. The Egyptians did not need to know who first carved it to respect it. They needed only to recognise that it belonged to a deeper layer of time. From this angle, the silence of the Sphinx becomes its defining feature. It does not explain itself. It does not instruct. It remains still while interpretations pass over it like shifting sand. The desert has buried it and revealed it repeatedly, as though time itself were breathing around it. This thought does not conclude anything. It does not resolve debates or settle dates. It simply reframes attention. Instead of asking when the Sphinx was built in a narrow sense, it invites consideration of how many worlds it has already watched rise and reorganize themselves around it. The monument does not need to belong neatly to one civilization to matter. Its power lies in its persistence, in its refusal to be fully claimed. As the story continues, the focus will remain on the stone itself, the land it inhabits, and the subtle signals left behind by erosion, proportion, and silence. The Sphinx does not hurry, and neither will this exploration. Time has already done its work here, slowly, patiently, leaving just enough uncertainty to keep the stone awake while civilizations sleep and wake again around it. The Sphinx that most people carry in their minds is a tidy thing. It belongs comfortably to a familiar story, one that fits neatly inside museum labels, school lessons, and simplified timelines. It is introduced as a companion to the pyramids, a stone expression of royal power, a symbolic guardian carved to watch over the necropolis of kings. In this version, the Sphinx is known, categorized, and finished. It has a date, a name, a purpose, and a builder. Once those pieces are in place, the monument is rarely revisited as a problem. It becomes scenery rather than subject. This version of the Sphinx is often encountered first through images. Photographs frame it against the pyramids, creating a visual shorthand that suggests a single moment of creation, a unified architectural plan, a civilization expressing itself through stone with clarity and intent. In books and documentaries, the Sphinx is usually introduced briefly, efficiently, almost as an aside. It is described, attributed, and then left behind as attention moves upward toward the pyramids, which are treated as the true focus of wonder. The Sphinx becomes familiar through repetition, and familiarity has a way of dulling curiosity. Yet the Sphinx that exists in stone does not fully cooperate with this tidy version. When encountered directly, either in person or through close study, it carries a weight that feels different from the story attached to it. It does not behave like a solved object. It does not radiate the same kind of intentional clarity found in later Egyptian monuments that proudly announce their creators and purposes. Instead, it gives off the impression of something inherited, something already present before it was fully understood. One reason the Sphinx is rarely questioned is its position within a broader narrative that feels stable. Ancient Egypt is one of the best-known early civilizations, rich in texts, art, and architectural continuity. It feels complete. When a monument is placed within that framework, it borrows certainty from the civilization itself. To question the Sphinx is to introduce uncertainty into a story that many people prefer to regard as settled. This does not mean the accepted narrative is wrong. It means it is comfortable, and comfort discourages scrutiny. The familiar Sphinx is often described as a symbol, but symbols usually speak clearly within the cultures that create them. Egyptian symbolism was precise, codified, and consistent. Gods were depicted with specific attributes. Proportions followed strict conventions. Text accompanied imagery to anchor meaning. The Sphinx, by contrast, is mute. Its symbolism has been inferred rather than declared. Its meaning has been reconstructed after the fact rather than preserved in words. This alone sets it apart from much of what dynastic Egypt left behind. There is also the matter of repetition. When an explanation is repeated often enough, it begins to feel self-evident. The idea that the Sphinx was built by Khafra has been stated so many times that it now feels like a fact even to those who could not point to the original evidence. Repetition creates solidity. Over time, explanations harden into assumptions, and assumptions quietly replace inquiry. The Sphinx we think we know is therefore a product not only of archaeology, but of habit. It is an object smoothed by familiarity. Its oddities are softened by distance, its inconsistencies overshadowed by the grandeur of the surrounding monuments. When seen from afar, it blends into the Giza complex as if it were always meant to be there in exactly the form we see today. The Sphinx we rarely question is different. It emerges only when attention lingers, when the monument is examined not as an illustration but as a physical presence. This Sphinx feels less like a statement and more like a residue. It looks worn in a way that does not quite match its environment. It carries damage that suggests endurance rather than collapse. Its posture is not triumphant. It is prone, grounded, stretched along the rock as though anchored rather than erected. This Sphinx does not demand interpretation. It tolerates it. It allows centuries of explanation to pass over it without responding. Dynasties rose, fell, and recorded their triumphs nearby, yet none felt compelled to leave a clear statement explaining its origin. Later cultures speculated, reimagined, and mythologized it. But the stone itself remained unchanged, indifferent to being named or renamed. One of the reasons this quieter Sphinx escapes questioning is that it does not obviously contradict the accepted story. It simply fails to confirm it in obvious ways. Archaeology often works best when evidence aligns cleanly with expectation. When it does not, the mismatch is often attributed to erosion, loss, or incomplete data. These are reasonable explanations, but they can also become convenient ones. Over time, unresolved details are quietly set aside rather than revisited. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx are a good example of this. They are visible, measurable, and difficult to ignore once noticed. Yet because they complicate the timeline rather than outright overturn it, they tend to be discussed briefly and then bracketed. The focus shifts back to what can be said with confidence. The uncertain is acknowledged and then left behind. The same is true of the Sphinx's proportions. The relationship between the head and the body is unusual. It does not immediately signal error or mystery, but it does suggest modification. This possibility does not fit easily into a narrative that presents the monument as a single, unified act of creation. Rather than explore the implications deeply, the topic is often treated as a footnote. Questioning the Sphinx also raises uncomfortable implications. If it predates dynastic Egypt, then the plateau itself becomes a site of continuity rather than origin. It suggests that Egypt inherited as much as it created. While this idea does not diminish Egyptian achievement, it complicates the story of civilization emerging cleanly from a single cultural source. Complexity makes narratives harder to teach, harder to summarize, and harder to package. There is also a psychological aspect to how monuments are understood. Large, ancient structures invite awe, but awe often seeks resolution. People want to know who built something, when, and why. An unanswered monument feels unsettling. Assigning the Sphinx to a known pharaoh restores balance. It gives the stone a place to belong. Once placed, it no longer feels like a question mark in the landscape. The Sphinx itself offers no resistance to this assignment. It does not contradict it outright. It simply remains. This passivity makes it easy to project certainty onto it. A monument that does not speak is often assumed to have nothing left to say. Yet silence can also be a form of endurance. The Sphinx has outlasted not only the people who likely carved it, but also those who first attempted to explain it. Greek interpretations faded, Roman restorations crumbled, medieval myths dissolved. Modern explanations too will eventually be revised. Through all of this, the stone remains unchanged in its essential presence. The rarely questioned Sphinx becomes more visible when attention shifts away from what is known and toward what is absent. There is no original inscription. There is no surviving record of its construction. There is no unambiguous textual reference to its creation in the earliest Egyptian writings. These absences are often explained as loss, erosion of records, or the accidents of time. All of that may be true, but absence is still data. Silence still carries weight. In many ancient cultures, the most important structures were the most described. Kings ensured their names were attached to their achievements. Builders marked their work. Victories were recorded. The lack of such markers on the Sphinx is striking not because it proves anything, but because it contrasts so sharply with Egyptian habits elsewhere. Another reason the Sphinx is rarely questioned is that it occupies a symbolic role that feels satisfying. It appears to guard the pyramids. It faces the sunrise. It embodies strength and watchfulness. These interpretations align comfortably with Egyptian cosmology, which emphasized order, balance, and continuity. The Sphinx fits the story well enough that few feel compelled to pull at its loose threads. Yet fitting well is not the same as originating there. Cultures often adopt existing symbols and reinterpret them. Sacred landscapes are reused. Ancient stones are repurposed. Meaning is layered rather than replaced. The Sphinx could belong to this pattern, serving different roles across different eras without losing its core presence. When the Sphinx is seen through this lens, it becomes less an expression of a single moment and more a participant in a long process. It may have been built, altered, restored, and reimagined multiple times. Each culture encountered it as something already there. Each layer of interpretation added meaning without erasing what came before. This idea does not require dramatic claims or lost empires. It requires only patience with time and respect for continuity. Human history is not a clean sequence of beginnings and endings. It is overlapping, recursive, and often incomplete. Structures can persist through multiple cultural identities without belonging exclusively to any of them. The Sphinx we think we know is stable because it is familiar. The Sphinx we rarely question is unsettling because it resists closure. It invites observation rather than conclusion. It does not argue for an alternative story. It simply refuses to fully support the one most often told. As attention continues to rest on the stone itself, more of these quiet mismatches come into view. They do not demand immediate answers. They accumulate slowly, like sediment. Over time, they reshape understanding not through shock, but through persistence. The Sphinx has always existed at the edge of explanation. Even when buried in sand, it was never truly hidden. Even when restored, it was never fully revealed. Its presence is constant, but its meaning remains slightly out of reach. This tension between familiarity and uncertainty is what keeps the monument alive in the imagination. The moment it becomes fully explained, it risks becoming inert. As long as it resists complete understanding, it continues to matter. What follows is not an attempt to strip the Sphinx of its Egyptian context, but to loosen the grip of certainty just enough to allow older possibilities to surface. The stone does not need to be rescued from history. It needs to be given room to exist across more of it. As the focus shifts further away from the story we are comfortable with, and closer to the physical reality of the monument, attention naturally settles on its material, its wear, and its relationship with the land itself. These are quieter details, easily overlooked, but they carry time in a different way. They speak not through words, but through patterns left behind by forces that do not care about dynasties or names. Long before crowns, long before royal names were carved into stone, long before the idea of Egypt existed as a unified place with borders, gods and dynasties. The land itself was already old. The Nile flowed before it was worshipped. The plateau at Giza rose before it was sacred. Human presence along the river predates writing by tens of thousands of years, and organised life took shape gradually, unevenly, without any clear moment that could be called a beginning. Civilization did not arrive fully formed, it accumulated. When we speak of ancient Egypt, we often compress vast spans of time into a single mental image. Pyramids, hieroglyphs, pharaohs, and gods appear together as if they emerged in one decisive surge. In reality, what we call Egypt was the result of a long and quiet convergence. Climate shifts, migrations, experimentation with agriculture, and slow social organisation all unfolded over millennia. The dynastic period, with its kings and monuments, sits on top of this deep foundation like a visible crust. Beneath it lies a far longer story that is less neatly preserved, but no less real. Before dynasties, the Nile Valley was not empty. Archaeological evidence shows continuous human occupation stretching back into the Paleolithic. Hunter-gatherers followed the river during wetter phases when the surrounding Sahara was not yet a desert, but a landscape of grasslands, lakes and seasonal rivers. Stone tools, hearths and settlement traces appear across the region, pointing to communities that understood the land intimately long before agriculture reshaped it. As the climate gradually dried, populations clustered more tightly around the Nile. This concentration did not happen overnight. It was a slow adaptation to changing conditions, one that encouraged cooperation, shared knowledge, and eventually more permanent settlements. These early communities did not think of themselves as Egyptians. They did not belong to a nation or worship a pantheon that had not yet been defined. They lived within rhythms of flood and retreat, learning the behaviour of the river through experience rather than doctrine. Over time, food production began to supplement foraging. Domesticated plants and animals appeared, not as a sudden revolution but as part of a long experimentation process. Pottery, storage and tool specialisation followed. Villages formed and dissolved. Trade networks expanded. Symbols began to appear on objects, hinting at emerging systems of meaning that predate formal writing. This pre-dynastic world was not primitive in the way it is sometimes imagined. It was adaptive, responsive, and regionally diverse. Different communities developed different practices based on local conditions. Some areas favoured pastoralism, others focused on riverine resources. Cultural exchange occurred along the Nile corridor and beyond it, linking northeastern Africa with the Levant and deeper regions of the continent. The idea of kingship emerged slowly within this context. Authority was not initially centralised. Leadership likely shifted based on circumstance, ritual importance, or control of resources. Over time, certain lineages gained prominence. Symbols of power became more defined. Burial practices grew more elaborate, reflecting changing beliefs about status, ancestry and continuity beyond death. It is within this long pre-dynastic development that the question of the Sphinx becomes more intriguing. If monumental stonework existed before dynasties, it would not appear as part of a sudden architectural explosion. It would likely belong to a tradition that valued permanence, landscape markers, and symbolic presence over inscription and proclamation. Such a structure would not announce its builders in writing because writing itself had not yet become a primary means of memory. Stone was already being worked long before pyramids rose. Quarrying techniques existed. Large blocks were shaped and transported for communal or ritual purposes. Megalithic traditions appear across the ancient world without reliance on metal tools or centralized states. The ability to shape stone does not require kings. It requires time, shared knowledge, and motivation rooted in belief or necessity. The plateau at Giza sits at a geographic threshold. It overlooks the Nile floodplain while remaining elevated, stable, and resistant to inundation. Long before it became associated with royal tombs, it would have been a natural focal point. High ground near a life-giving river carries meaning in almost every culture. It offers visibility, safety, and symbolic distance from the cycles of flood and decay below. If a monumental figure were carved there in a pre-dynastic context, it would likely reflect concerns different from those of later pharaohs. It would not need to glorify a ruler or serve as a funerary guardian. It could function as a marker of territory, a symbol of continuity, or a focal point for ritual tied to the land and sky, rather than to a throne. The lion form associated with the Sphinx is older than Egypt as a state. Large feline symbolism appears across Africa and the Near East, in contexts that predate formal civilizations. Lions embodied strength, vigilance, and liminality, existing between the human and the wild. A human-headed lion combines animal power with human awareness, a synthesis that does not belong exclusively to dynastic theology. It is a form that could arise independently wherever humans sought to express authority through hybrid imagery. Before the name Egypt existed, there was no single identity binding the Nile Valley. The very word Egypt comes from Greek, derived from an Egyptian term referring to a temple complex at Memphis. The people who lived along the river did not call their land by that name. They identified with regions, settlements, and local traditions. National identity, as later understood, had not yet solidified. This matters because it changes how we think about origins. A structure built before the concept of Egypt would not be an anomaly. It would simply belong to a different layer of history, one that later cultures inherited rather than created. The absence of dynastic markers would not indicate mystery so much as context. The structure would predate the habit of naming, claiming, and recording. When dynasties eventually emerged, they did so by consolidating existing traditions. Religious symbols were formalized. Deities absorbed earlier local spirits. Sacred sites were reorganized within a new ideological framework. Kingship did not erase what came before it. It reorganized it, aligning older practices with new structures of power. In this process, older monuments could be reinterpreted. A structure that once served a communal or territorial function might be reframed as a royal guardian. Its meaning would shift without requiring its physical form to change entirely. Modifications could be made, faces could be reshaped, associations could be rewritten through myth and ritual rather than through physical reconstruction. The lack of early textual references to the Sphinx fits this pattern. If the structure existed before writing was widely used, its origin would be preserved through oral tradition, ritual practice, or simple acceptance rather than documentation. When writing later became central to Egyptian culture, the monument would already be ancient. Its story would be inherited, incomplete, and perhaps already partially forgotten. Egyptian culture placed immense value on antiquity. The past was not something to be replaced, but something to be aligned with. Ancient sites were restored rather than abandoned. Old symbols were revived rather than discarded. To inherit an already ancient monument would not diminish royal authority. It would enhance it by linking the present to a deeper, almost mythic past. Seen this way, the Sphinx becomes less a puzzle and more a bridge. It connects a time before kings to a time of kingship. It stands at the threshold between prehistory and history, between landscape and ideology. Its silence makes sense because it belongs to a period when stone carried meaning without words. The environment itself supports this long view. Geological evidence indicates that the region experienced significantly wetter conditions thousands of years before dynastic Egypt. Rainfall patterns capable of shaping stone through prolonged exposure existed during these earlier periods. Human populations were present to witness and adapt to these conditions. The land the Sphinx occupies has not always been a desert plateau. It has lived multiple lives. If the Sphinx's body bears the memory of water, it may also bear the memory of a human world organized differently from the one recorded in hieroglyphs. A world without pharaohs does not mean a world without meaning. It means meaning expressed through different forms, slower traditions, and structures that valued endurance over explanation. As dynastic Egypt rose, it built upward. Pyramids pierced the skyline. Obelisks reached for the sun. Writing covered walls. Authority became vertical and visible. The Sphinx, by contrast, remained horizontal, grounded and largely unchanged. It did not compete with the new order, it coexisted with it. This coexistence is telling. Truly foreign structures are often destroyed or erased. The Sphinx was not. It was maintained, cleared of sand, integrated into ritual life. This suggests recognition rather than confusion. The Egyptians may not have known exactly who built it, but they knew it mattered. The transition from pre-dynastic communities to dynastic statehood was not a clean break. It was a reorganization layered over what already existed. The Sphinx fits comfortably into this continuity, if it is understood as part of the deeper layer rather than the surface one. Before Egypt had a name, before kings claimed divine authority, before writing fixed memory into stone, the land itself was shaping human thought. The river taught cycles, the sky taught orientation, stone taught endurance. A monument born in this context would not need explanation to persist. Its meaning would be carried forward simply by remaining. As attention continues to move deeper into this earlier world, it becomes less useful to ask for exact dates, and more useful to observe patterns. What kinds of structures endure across cultures? How landscapes guide human behaviour? Why some monuments feel rooted in time rather than placed within it. The Sphinx, viewed from this earlier horizon, no longer feels premature or misplaced. It feels appropriate to a world where identity had not yet hardened into dynasties, where memory was preserved through presence rather than proclamation, and where stone served as a conversation with time rather than a signature upon it. From here, the focus naturally shifts to the physical details that hint at this longer life. The stone itself carries clues that belong not to ideology, but to environment. Erosion, weathering, and proportion speak in a language older than writing. They invite attention away from names and toward processes that unfold slowly, without concern for human calendars or royal reigns. There is a subtle sensation that many people experience when they look at the Sphinx, even if they cannot articulate it clearly. It is not awe in the way the pyramids inspire awe, and it is not confusion in the way ruins often provoke curiosity. It is something quieter and more persistent. The feeling that the Sphinx does not fully belong to the architectural moment that surrounds it, that it is present among the pyramids, but not quite of them. This impression has followed the monument for centuries, crossing cultures, languages, and eras without attaching itself to any single explanation. The pyramids announce themselves as products of a specific time. They rise with intention, precision, and confidence. Their angles are sharp, their geometry deliberate, their scale commanding. Even in ruin, they retain a sense of planned dominance. They are statements made in stone, expressions of authority meant to be seen, measured, and remembered. The Sphinx, by contrast, does not announce. It does not rise. It does not dominate the skyline. It remains low, horizontal, carved into the bedrock itself, as if it were not placed there so much as revealed. This difference in posture alone creates a temporal dissonance. Structures that are conceived as monuments tend to separate themselves from the ground. They assert themselves against the landscape. The Sphinx does the opposite. Its body is continuous with the plateau, emerging from it rather than standing upon it. This makes it feel less like a construction and more like a remnant, something uncovered rather than built. The sense of age comes not from damage alone. Many ancient structures are damaged, yet do not feel older than their context. The Colosseum does not feel older than Rome. Medieval cathedrals do not feel older than the cities around them. The Sphinx carries a different weight. Its wear feels cumulative rather than catastrophic. It suggests long exposure rather than sudden decline. Its surface tells a story of persistence rather than collapse. Part of this impression comes from how the Sphinx interacts with the surrounding architecture. The pyramids appear finished in their conception, even if time has altered them. The Sphinx appears altered in its conception, as though it has been adapted, repaired, or reshaped across multiple periods. The head, smaller and more refined than the body, seems to belong to a different moment than the torso. This creates the quiet sense that time has worked on the monument not only from the outside but from within its design. Egyptian architecture elsewhere rarely produces this feeling. Temples, statues, and reliefs tend to display stylistic consistency. Even when restored or expanded, they maintain visual coherence. Changes are recorded. Additions are marked. The Sphinx resists this clarity. Its proportions do not align neatly with known conventions. Its features do not sit comfortably within a single stylistic period. There is also the matter of context. The pyramids were built as part of a clear funerary landscape. Their purpose is reinforced by associated temples, causeways, and burial practices. The Sphinx occupies this space, but it does not explain itself through it. Its function must be inferred rather than read. This alone sets it apart. When a structure requires interpretation rather than instruction, it often belongs to a deeper or less documented layer of history. Ancient observers seem to sense this difference as well. Greek writers did not treat the Sphinx as a recent or even specifically Egyptian creation. They spoke of it as something already ancient, something whose origin lay beyond clear memory. Roman accounts describe it as a relic rather than a monument. These reactions are telling not because they are authoritative, but because they reflect a consistent perception. Even thousands of years ago, people felt that the Sphinx came from farther back than the structures around it. The environment contributes to this impression in subtle ways. The limestone of the Sphinx has aged differently than the blocks used in the pyramids. The body shows deep undulations, rounded edges, and vertical weathering patterns that contrast with the sharper erosion seen on quarried stone. This difference does not immediately announce itself as a contradiction, but it accumulates over time. The eye begins to sense that the stone has lived through more than one climatic regime. This sense of deep time is reinforced by the way the Sphinx has repeatedly disappeared and re-emerged. It has been buried by sand many times, then uncovered, restored, and buried again. Each cycle adds another layer of history without erasing the ones beneath it. The pyramids, while also affected by sand, never vanished to the same degree. They remained visible, dominant, fixed. The Sphinx slipped in and out of view, as though it belonged as much to the earth as to human memory. Burial has a strange effect on perception. Objects that are buried and uncovered repeatedly tend to feel older than those that remain exposed. They acquire a sense of having waited. The Sphinx feels like something that has endured neglect and rediscovery rather than continuous use. This pattern aligns more closely with prehistoric or transitional monuments than with the carefully maintained structures of dynastic Egypt. The restorations themselves add to this impression. Historical records show that the Sphinx was already in need of repair during the New Kingdom. Pharaohs cleared sand, rebuilt walls, and reinforced sections of the monument. They did not present these actions as the maintenance of a recent royal creation. They framed them as acts of reverence towards something ancient. Restoration language is different from construction language. It implies inheritance rather than authorship. When a civilization restores something rather than replaces it, it signals respect for antiquity. Egypt was particularly sensitive to this. Older structures were often incorporated into newer religious frameworks. Past kings were honoured. Ancestral sites were preserved. The Sphinx fits this pattern of inherited significance rather than freshly asserted power. The sense of age also comes from the monument's expression. The face of the Sphinx does not convey the assertive individuality seen in many royal statues. It appears calm, detached, almost impersonal. This is not the triumphant gaze of a ruler proclaiming authority. It is the steady look of something that has watched change rather than caused it. Expression influences perception. A monument that appears observational rather than declarative feels older because it seems to stand outside immediate political time. Another contributing factor is the absence of narrative decoration. Egyptian monuments are often covered in text and imagery, explaining their purpose, dedication, and mythological context. The Sphinx is largely undecorated. It relies on form rather than inscription. This simplicity is deceptive. It suggests either an origin before the widespread use of writing in monumental contexts, or a function that did not require explanation through words. Monuments without text tend to feel older, because they belong to periods when meaning was conveyed through placement, scale, and symbolism rather than explicit narration. Stone circles, standing stones, and early megalithic structures across the world share this quality. The Sphinx aligns more closely with this tradition than with the text-heavy monuments of later Egypt. The land itself reinforces this sense. The Giza plateau is geologically ancient, shaped long before human settlement. The Sphinx is carved directly from this ancient rock, making it feel inseparable from the land's own deep history. The pyramids, while built on the plateau, are composed of quarried blocks assembled atop it. This distinction matters. One feels embedded, the other feels placed. Embedded structures often carry a sense of timelessness because they seem to arise from the earth itself. They blur the boundary between natural and human-made. The Sphinx occupies this ambiguous zone. It is clearly shaped by human hands, yet inseparable from the geological context in which it exists. This makes it harder to assign it to a single historical moment. There is also the psychological effect of familiarity paired with uncertainty. The Sphinx is one of the most recognizable monuments in the world, yet it remains oddly undefined. This combination creates a feeling of depth. Objects that are both familiar and unresolved tend to feel older because they resist closure. The mind senses that understanding has not caught up with presence. Cultural memory plays a role as well. The Sphinx has been interpreted and reinterpreted repeatedly. It has been a god, a guardian, a riddle, a relic, a tourist attraction. Each layer of meaning adds age rather than replacing it. The monument accumulates identities rather than shedding them. This accumulation gives it a temporal density that newer structures lack. The pyramids, despite their age, are culturally specific. They belong clearly to ancient Egypt. The Sphinx feels more universal. Its hybrid form appears in multiple cultures across time. Human-headed lions, animal guardians, and composite beings appear from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. This universality makes the Sphinx feel less anchored to one place and time, contributing to the sense that it originates from a deeper, shared human impulse. None of these factors alone prove anything. Together they create an impression that is difficult to dismiss. The Sphinx feels older because it behaves like something older. It does not conform neatly to its surroundings. It does not explain itself. It carries physical and symbolic traits associated with long continuity rather than singular creation. This does not mean it must predate Egypt by thousands of years. It means that the monument invites that possibility by resisting easy alignment with dynastic narratives. The feeling of age is not an argument. It is a signal. It suggests that time has interacted with the Sphinx differently than with the structures around it. As attention continues to narrow toward the physical details of the monument, this feeling begins to take on sharper outlines. Proportion, surface, and material become increasingly important. The stone itself starts to speak more clearly than the stories told about it. The sense that the Sphinx is older than its surroundings is not the result of speculation layered onto stone. It arises from the interaction between form, environment, and history. It persists because it has not been resolved, only managed. Each explanation so far has smoothed over the discomfort without fully addressing it. This unresolved quality is what allows the monument to remain alive in the imagination. It does not settle into the past. It remains slightly out of time, watching dynasties rise around it, accepting restoration without losing identity, absorbing meaning without being defined by it. As the focus moves closer still, attention will shift from perception to physical mismatch. The body and the head, the scale and the detail, the sense that something has been altered rather than created whole. These are not dramatic clues, they're quiet inconsistencies, the kind that only reveal themselves when time is allowed to linger. One of the most persistent impressions left by the Sphinx is not dramatic or immediately obvious. It does not announce itself the way missing inscriptions or unusual erosion patterns do. Instead, it settles slowly, almost subconsciously, as the eye adjusts to the monument's proportions. The longer one looks, the harder it becomes to ignore a quiet imbalance. The body feels massive, elongated and grounded, while the head appears comparatively small, refined and constrained. This contrast does not shout error, but it whispers alteration. It creates the uneasy sense that these two parts did not originate together in the way we are accustomed to seeing in Egyptian monumental art. Egyptian sculptors were exceptionally skilled at proportion. Their statues followed strict canonical systems that governed the relationship between head, torso, limbs, and overall scale. These systems were not merely aesthetic preferences, they were expressions of cosmic order, balance, and harmony. Deviations were rare and usually purposeful, serving symbolic or theological goals. When viewed within this tradition, the Sphinx's proportions feel unusual. The body is immense, carved deeply into the limestone bedrock, while the head sits atop it like a later addition, carefully shaped but spatially constrained. This sensation does not require advanced measurement to be noticed. Even casual observers often remark that the head looks too small for the body. The neck appears narrow relative to the shoulders. The face feels compressed, as though it has been carved out of an already limited volume of stone. These impressions accumulate not as proof, but as discomfort. They suggest that something about the monument's current form is the result of compromise rather than original design. One way to understand this is through the idea of recarving. If the body of the Sphinx were already ancient when dynastic Egyptians encountered it, reshaping the head to reflect a ruler or deity would have been a logical act of appropriation. The available stone at the top of the structure would have been limited by the original form. A larger head may have existed once, eroded or intentionally removed over time. What remains would dictate what could be carved next. The result would be a head that fits within constraints imposed by an earlier shape, rather than one freely designed from raw stone. This scenario aligns with the physical realities of carving. Stone does not forgive. Once removed, it cannot be replaced. Sculptors working with an inherited monument would have had to work within what remained. The current head's proportions reflect this limitation. It is detailed where it can be, but it lacks the scale that would naturally match the body beneath it. The body itself reinforces this impression. It is not merely large, it is deeply integrated into the bedrock. The paws extend forward with mass and weight. The torso stretches long and low, suggesting an original emphasis on grounded presence rather than vertical display. This body feels designed to endure, to anchor itself within the landscape rather than stand apart from it. Its scale suggests a function rooted in permanence rather than portraiture. In contrast, the head bears hallmarks of dynastic Egyptian style. The face has been interpreted as royal. The headdress resembles known forms. The features align more closely with human representation than with the animal power expressed by the body. This stylistic difference creates a temporal layering. The body speaks in a language of form and mass. The head speaks in a language of identity and authority. Such layering is not unknown in ancient cultures. Throughout history, monuments have been altered to suit new rulers, new beliefs, or new political realities. Faces are replaced, names are erased, symbols are reinterpreted. In Egypt itself, statues were often recarved by later kings to assert continuity or dominance. This practice was practical as well as symbolic. Stone was valuable, reuse was efficient, appropriation linked the present to the authority of the past. The Sphinx, however, represents this practice on an unusually large scale. Altering a small statue is one thing, adapting a monument carved into the living rock of a plateau is another. The effort required suggests that the structure already held significant importance. It was not something to be ignored or dismantled, it was something to be claimed. The mismatch between body and head also appears in the degree of weathering. The body shows extensive erosion across broad surfaces. The head, while damaged, appears comparatively preserved. This difference has often been explained by later protective measures, such as coverings or restorations. While these explanations may be partially correct, they also reinforce the sense of temporal difference. The body appears to have endured longer exposure to environmental forces than the head. This pattern fits the idea that the body existed earlier and was subjected to conditions no longer present during dynastic times. The head, reshaped or refined later, would have experienced a different climatic history. Even small differences in age can produce noticeable contrasts when measured across thousands of years. The neck provides another subtle clue. It is narrow relative to the mass it supports. Structurally, this is not ideal. Egyptian engineers were careful with load distribution. Narrow connections between massive elements are uncommon in their large-scale stonework, unless dictated by constraint. The neck of the Sphinx feels constrained. It feels like the remnant of a larger form rather than the intentional base of a head conceived alongside the body. This sense of constraint extends upward. The crown area lacks the height one might expect if the head were carved freely. The top appears flattened, as though limited by the original stone volume. This has led to speculation that the head may once have depicted a different figure entirely, possibly an animal with a longer snout or a more expansive shape, later reshaped into a human visage. Such speculation does not require exotic assumptions. Recarving stone is a common practice. The challenge lies not in the possibility, but in the scale. The Sphinx would represent one of the largest examples of such transformation in human history. Yet scale alone does not make something impossible. It simply makes it rare. The unease created by this mismatch is compounded by how quietly it persists. There is no definitive line separating body from head. No visible seam announces alteration. Instead, the transition feels smooth, almost too smooth, as though effort was made to disguise the change. This subtlety suggests respect rather than indifference. Whoever altered the head did not treat the body as disposable. They treated it as something that needed to remain intact. Egyptian religion provides a framework for understanding this respect. Ancient Egyptians believed that certain places were inherently powerful. Sacred landscapes were not created so much as recognized. Once identified, they were maintained and integrated into religious practice. Altering a monument within such a landscape would require care, both practical and ritual. Preservation mattered. The mismatch, therefore, does not feel accidental. It feels managed. It carries the imprint of intention layered atop inheritance. The body speaks of an earlier moment when the emphasis was on form, animal strength, and grounded presence. The head speaks of a later moment when identity, kingship, and human authority took precedence. This duality creates the unsettling feeling that the Sphinx belongs to more than one time at once. It is not simply old, it is layered. Its body and head act as physical markers of different historical priorities. Together, they form a composite not only of human and animal, but of eras. This temporal layering helps explain why the Sphinx resists simple classification. It is not purely prehistoric. It is not purely dynastic. It sits between categories, incorporating elements of both without fully belonging to either. This liminal quality contributes to its enduring fascination. Objects that occupy thresholds tend to attract attention because they disrupt clear narratives. The pyramids nearby do not produce this effect. Their blocks, courses, and proportions speak consistently. They may have been modified or repaired, but their overall form remains coherent. The Sphinx, by contrast, invites scrutiny precisely because coherence feels incomplete. Something about it does not resolve. This lack of resolution has often been treated as a problem to be explained away rather than a feature to be understood. Archaeological narratives favour clarity. They prefer monuments that fit neatly into known timelines and cultural frameworks. The Sphinx complicates this preference. It requires a story that allows for continuity across deep time, for adaptation rather than creation. When viewed from this perspective, the mismatch becomes less troubling and more informative. It suggests that the Sphinx was important enough to be preserved across transitions. It was not abandoned when dynastic culture emerged. It was not destroyed or replaced. It was altered just enough to fit within a new worldview. This approach aligns with how ancient cultures often dealt with the past. They did not see history as something to be erased. They saw it as something to be integrated. By reshaping the head, dynastic Egyptians could align the monument with their concept of kingship while retaining the power associated with its ancient body. The resulting structure would embody both continuity and change. It would anchor the new order to an older one, lending legitimacy through association with deep time. The Sphinx would become a bridge between worlds, physically and symbolically. This bridging role may explain why the monument was so carefully maintained even when buried by sand. Clearing it was not simply an act of maintenance, it was an act of recognition. Each restoration reaffirmed its significance without fully redefining it. The uneasy feeling of mismatch, therefore, does not demand immediate resolution. It functions as an invitation to slow down, to accept that some structures carry histories that are not linear. The Sphinx may not have been born whole in a single moment. It may have grown into its current form through adaptation, reinterpretation, and survival. Such growth leaves traces. Proportions shift. Surfaces weather differently. Forms carry memory in ways that writing cannot. The Sphinx's body remembers a world shaped by different priorities than the one that shaped its head. As attention moves forward, the focus naturally shifts from proportion to surface. The stone itself carries marks that do not align neatly with the desert environment in which the monument now sits. These marks speak less about human intention and more about natural processes acting over long spans of time. In them, the question of age becomes not philosophical, but physical, written quietly into the limestone itself. The surface of the Sphinx carries a kind of memory that does not rely on symbols or stories. It is written instead in grooves, rounded edges, softened contours, and long vertical channels that run down the body as though traced by repeated contact with something persistent and directional. Stone does not forget what shapes it. It records pressure, exposure, and duration with quiet accuracy. When examined closely, the weathering on the Sphinx tells a story that does not sit comfortably within the environment that surrounds it today. The Giza plateau is arid. It has been arid for thousands of years. Wind, sand, and extreme temperature shifts dominate the erosional processes of deserts. These forces shape stone in predictable ways. Wind-driven sand abrades surfaces horizontally. It scours edges. It produces sharp undercuts, faceted planes, and pitted textures. Temperature fluctuation causes cracking and flaking, especially in layered limestone. These patterns are well understood and widely documented across desert monuments. The Sphinx does not display these patterns uniformly. Instead, much of its body shows deep, rounded undulations and vertical weathering channels that run downward along the torso and enclosure walls. These grooves are smoothed, not sharp. They appear to have been carved by repeated flow rather than abrasive impact. They resemble the marks left by water moving over stone for extended periods of time, not sand blasting it sideways. This distinction matters because erosion is not random. Different agents leave different signatures. Water behaves differently from wind. Rainfall produces vertical runoff. It follows gravity. It pools, drains, and repeats. Over time, it rounds stone, deepens channels, and smooths surfaces. These effects are especially visible on limestone, which is relatively soft and vulnerable to prolonged moisture. The Sphinx enclosure, the trench carved around the monument, displays some of the most striking examples of this kind of weathering. The walls show wave-like patterns that suggest repeated saturation and drying. These formations are not isolated. They appear consistently across surfaces that would have been exposed to runoff. Their scale suggests long-term exposure rather than brief or rare events. Desert rain does occur, but it is sporadic, infrequent, and typically insufficient to produce such pronounced erosion over the timescales associated with dynastic Egypt. Occasional storms can cause damage, but they do not generally create deep, uniform weathering across massive stone faces. The patterns seen on the Sphinx imply a climate in which water was a regular presence, not an anomaly. This observation does not require speculation. It rests on basic principles of geology. When geologists examine rock formations, they identify erosional features and match them to known processes. The same methods used to study cliffs, canyons, and ancient shorelines apply here. The Sphinx, when treated as a geological object rather than a symbolic one, presents characteristics that are difficult to reconcile with a hyper-arid environment lasting the entirety of its existence. The Sahara was not always a desert. Geological and climatological evidence shows that the region underwent significant climatic shifts over the past tens of thousands of years. There were periods when the Sahara was green, dotted with lakes, rivers, and vegetation. These wet phases supported human populations and diverse ecosystems. During such times, rainfall would have been frequent and intense enough to shape exposed rock. These wet periods predate dynastic Egypt by several millennia. If the Sphinx's body was carved during one of these earlier climatic phases, the water erosion visible today would make sense. The stone would have been exposed to rain over long spans of time before the region gradually dried into the desert known today. This does not mean that all erosion on the Sphinx must date to a single wet period. Erosion is cumulative. Early water weathering could have established deep channels and rounded forms, later modified by wind and sand. What matters is the initial signature. Once water shapes stone in a particular way, subsequent processes build upon that foundation rather than erase it entirely. Attempts to attribute the Sphinx's erosion entirely to wind and sand often require complex explanations, involving localized conditions, groundwater seepage, or unusual material composition. While these factors may contribute in small ways, they struggle to account for the consistency and scale of the weathering patterns across the monument and its enclosure. Groundwater erosion, for example, would typically affect stone from below or produce irregular damage where moisture accumulates. It does not easily explain vertical channels descending from upper surfaces. Wind erosion, while powerful, tends to sharpen edges rather than soften them. It creates angular features, not flowing contours. The difference becomes clear when comparing the Sphinx to other structures at Giza. Blocks used in the pyramids show erosion consistent with desert exposure. Their edges are sharper, their surfaces bear the marks of wind abrasion. The Sphinx's body, carved directly from bedrock, displays a different erosional character. This contrast suggests different exposure histories, not simply different construction techniques. The enclosure walls surrounding the Sphinx deepen this contrast. These walls were cut into the plateau at the same time as the body was shaped. They should therefore share the same exposure history. Instead, they exhibit weathering that appears older and more water-influenced than the surfaces of nearby quarried stone. This implies that the enclosure existed during a period when water played a larger role in shaping the landscape. The idea that such erosion could have occurred entirely during dynastic times would require a significantly wetter climate than is supported by most evidence from that period. While the Nile flooded annually, this flooding did not involve sustained rainfall over the plateau itself. The river's behaviour shaped the floodplain, not the high ground where the Sphinx sits. Rainfall sufficient to carve deep channels into limestone would have been a regular occurrence over centuries or millennia. Such conditions align more closely with the earlier wet phases of the region than with the relatively stable aridity of the last 5,000 years. This does not automatically date the Sphinx to a specific year or culture. It does, however, suggest that its exposure history extends further back than traditionally assumed. Stone remembers climate. The Sphinx's body appears to remember a time when water fell from the sky often enough to leave lasting marks. The head of the Sphinx complicates this picture in an interesting way. It shows less water erosion than the body. Its features are worn, but not in the same deeply rounded manner. This difference supports the idea that the head was modified or reshaped later, after the wetter conditions had passed. A later carving would naturally bear a different erosional signature. This discrepancy between head and body is not merely aesthetic, it is geological. It implies that different parts of the monument experience different environmental histories. This is difficult to explain if the entire structure was carved at the same time under the same conditions. Restoration efforts throughout history also affect erosion patterns. Blocks were added, surfaces were reinforced, repairs altered exposure. Yet restoration tends to introduce new stone with different textures and weathering rates. These additions are often distinguishable from the original material. They do not usually mimic deep, ancient erosion. Historical records indicate that Egyptian restorers were concerned with preserving the Sphinx from further damage. They cleared sand, reinforced weak areas, and repaired cracks. These actions suggest that the monument was already showing signs of age and vulnerability long before modern times. They treated it as something inherited rather than newly created. If the Sphinx had been carved only a few centuries earlier, it would not likely have required such extensive attention so soon. Stone monuments endure. They weather slowly. The urgency of restoration implies long prior exposure. The argument here is not that the desert has no effect on stone. It clearly does. Rather, it is that the dominant weathering features on the Sphinx are not easily explained by desert processes alone. They point toward a more complex exposure history that includes prolonged interaction with water. This realization shifts the conversation from symbolism to environment. It invites consideration of when the Sphinx first stood exposed to the elements. If that moment occurred during a wetter climatic phase, then its origins likely lie deeper in time than dynastic Egypt. The landscape itself supports this deeper timeline. The plateau bears signs of ancient runoff channels beyond the Sphinx enclosure. The surrounding region contains evidence of old drainage systems formed when rainfall was more abundant. The Sphinx does not exist in isolation from these features. It is part of a broader geological context. Human populations during these wetter periods were not passive observers. They adapted, settled, and built. Stoneworking traditions existed. Sacred sites were marked. There is no inherent reason why monumental carving could not have occurred during this time, especially if it served communal or symbolic purposes rather than royal ones. The idea that early societies lacked the organisation or motivation to carve such a monument underestimates the complexity of prehistoric cultures. Monumental construction appears across the world in contexts that predate writing, metallurgy, and centralised states. Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, and numerous megalithic sites stand as reminders that humans have long invested effort into shaping stone for reasons that transcend survival. The Sphinx, viewed through the lens of weathering, begins to resemble these structures more than later dynastic monuments. It feels like part of an older tradition that prioritised permanence, placement, and symbolic presence over explicit explanation. This perspective does not strip Egypt of its achievements. Instead, it enriches them. Inheriting an ancient monument and integrating it into a complex civilization demonstrates continuity, respect for antiquity, and an ability to weave past and present into a coherent worldview. The weathering marks on the Sphinx do not accuse. They do not announce dates or builders. They simply persist. They remain visible despite centuries of interpretation layered over them. They're quiet witnesses to conditions that no longer exist. Stone shaped by water remembers rain long after the sky has dried. The Sphinx's body carries that memory in its curves and channels. It does not belong entirely to the desert because it was not born entirely within one. As attention moves forward, the focus naturally widens from the stone itself to the environment that once surrounded it. Climate, landscape, and human presence form an inseparable context. Understanding the Sphinx requires looking not only at who might have carved it, but at the world in which carving it would have made sense. The desert we see today is only the latest chapter in a long environmental story. The Sphinx appears to have lived through more than one of those chapters, shaped first by water, then by wind, then by human care. Each phase left its mark without erasing the previous one. In this way, the monument becomes less a riddle and more a record, not of words or dynasties, but of time itself, written slowly into stone by forces that do not concern themselves with human timelines. There was a time when the land that would later be called Egypt did not look like Egypt at all. The image most people carry is fixed and dry, a ribbon of green clinging to the Nile, bordered by endless sand and empty horizons. That image is accurate for the last several thousand years, but it is not the whole story. Beneath the desert lies the memory of a very different climate, one that shaped the land slowly and persistently, leaving traces that have not entirely vanished. The Sphinx appears to belong to that older world, a time when rain was not a rarity, and water shaped stone in ways that wind alone cannot. Climate does not change suddenly on a human scale. It shifts gradually, often imperceptibly across generations. People adapt without noticing that they are living through a transformation that will one day feel impossible to imagine. The Sahara did not become a desert overnight. It dried over thousands of years, transitioning from a landscape of grasslands, lakes, and seasonal rivers into the arid expanse seen today. During this long transformation, the region supported abundant life. Rock art across North Africa depicts giraffes, cattle, and lush vegetation, scenes that could not exist in the present environment. These images are not symbolic, they are records. Geological studies confirm what the art suggests. Sediment cores, fossil pollen, and ancient lake beds all point to repeated wet phases across the Sahara. Rainfall patterns shifted northward. Monsoon systems extended farther than they do now. Rivers flowed where sand dunes stand today. These were not brief anomalies. Some wet periods lasted thousands of years, creating stable environments in which human populations could thrive. During these phases, rainfall would have been regular enough to affect exposed stone surfaces significantly. Limestone, the material from which the Sphinx is carved, is particularly vulnerable to prolonged moisture. Water seeps into its layers, dissolving minerals and weakening the structure over time. Repeated wetting and drying around edges deepens channels and produces the kind of vertical erosion patterns seen on the Sphinx's body and enclosure walls. The Giza plateau sits above the floodplain, but it was not immune to these climatic conditions. Rainfall does not respect elevation. Water would have flowed across the plateau, draining into natural depressions, carving channels, and pooling against exposed stone. Over centuries, this process would leave unmistakable marks. These are the marks observed today on the Sphinx. The idea that Egypt once experienced significant rainfall often feels counterintuitive because it conflicts with the image of a civilization defined by the Nile's predictable flooding rather than by rain. Yet the Nile's behaviour itself is tied to rainfall, not within Egypt, but far to the south. Even in historic times, the river's annual inundation depended on rains falling in distant highlands. Water has always shaped the region, even when it was not falling locally. Before dynastic Egypt stabilised around a relatively arid climate, local rainfall played a more prominent role. Seasonal storms would have refreshed the land, supported vegetation, and sustained wildlife beyond the immediate reach of the river. Human communities during this time did not rely solely on the Nile. They occupied a broader landscape, moving with the seasons, adapting to shifting water sources. In such a world, carving a monument into bedrock would not be an act of defiance against nature. It would be an engagement with it. The presence of water would not be a threat to stone in the short term. It would be a shaping force, something understood and accepted. Structures built during this period would be designed with endurance in mind, not with the expectation of complete environmental stability. As the climate dried, these assumptions would change. Rain would become rare, wind would dominate erosion, the landscape would harden, human settlement would contract toward the Nile. Practices developed during wetter times would become obsolete or forgotten. Memory of the older climate would fade as generations grew up knowing only the desert. This loss of climatic memory is not unusual. Human cultures adapt quickly to prevailing conditions and often forget what came before if it no longer shapes daily life. Oral traditions may preserve fragments, but without physical reminders, environmental history becomes abstract. The land, however, remembers. Stone retains evidence long after stories fade. The Sphinx can be seen as one such reminder. Its weathering does not align with the climate Egypt remembers because it was shaped during a climate Egypt no longer knows. By the time writing flourished and dynasties recorded their achievements, the rains that once fell regularly on the plateau had already retreated. The desert had become familiar. The memory of rain-shaping stone would have seemed distant, even improbable. This helps explain why later cultures did not question the erosion patterns more deeply. Without lived experience of sustained rainfall, it would be difficult to imagine water as the primary shaping force. Wind and sand would seem like sufficient explanations. Over time, these explanations would become entrenched, not because they were perfect, but because they matched contemporary experience. Yet geology does not adapt its testimony to human expectation. It preserves processes regardless of whether they are remembered. The Sphinx's body tells of water moving repeatedly across its surface, not once or twice, but enough times to leave deep impressions. These impressions suggest centuries, not decades, of exposure. Some have argued that the water responsible could have come from rare but intense storms. While such events do occur, their effects are typically uneven and chaotic. They cause sudden damage, not the smooth, consistent erosion seen on the Sphinx. Prolonged rainfall produces patterns that are orderly, repetitive, and directional. This is what is observed. Others suggest that water may have risen from the ground, seeping upward through the limestone. Groundwater can indeed cause erosion, but it tends to produce different features, often localized and irregular. The vertical channels on the Sphinx's body indicate water flowing downward, not rising. They align with gravity, not with subsurface pressure. The enclosure walls offer further insight. These walls were carved into the plateau to isolate the Sphinx from the surrounding rock. Their surfaces show similar water-induced erosion, implying that the entire area was exposed during the same wet conditions. If the Sphinx were carved during dynastic times, these walls would not have experienced such prolonged rainfall afterward. The climate simply would not support it. The timing of the Sahara's drying aligns with this interpretation. The last major wet phase ended several thousand years before the rise of dynastic Egypt. During this transition, human population shifted, and the environmental context that supported broader settlement patterns gave way to a more river-centered way of life. Monumental traditions from the earlier period would have stood as remnants of a world that no longer existed. When dynastic Egypt emerged, it did so in a landscape already shaped by this long climatic transformation. The desert was not new, but it was dominant. Structures built during this time reflect an understanding of aridity. They rely on elevation, stone block construction, and minimal exposure to water. The pyramids exemplify this adaptation. Their design minimizes surface complexity and directs any rare rainfall away efficiently. The Sphinx does not follow this logic. Its form invites water to interact with it. Its body presents broad surfaces and contours that would channel runoff rather than shed it completely. This design makes sense in a wetter climate where rainfall is expected and managed and not feared as an anomaly. This contrast suggests different assumptions about the environment at the time of construction. The Sphinx appears to have been shaped with an acceptance of water as part of the landscape, not as an occasional threat. This acceptance aligns with the wet phases of the region's past. The idea that Egypt no longer remembers this climate does not imply ignorance, it implies distance. Cultural memory fades when conditions change, practices evolve. What was once central becomes irrelevant. Over generations, the environment people experience becomes the only one they know. The past climate becomes invisible unless preserved in stone, sediment, or art. The Sphinx preserves that memory physically. It does not explain it. It simply bears the marks. Later cultures inherited the monument without inheriting the climate that shaped it. They maintained it within a new environmental context, interpreting it through the lens of their own experience. This inheritance would naturally lead to reinterpretation. A monument built in a wetter world might take on new meanings in a drier one. Its relationship to water would be forgotten. Its form would be explained symbolically rather than environmentally. Over time, the original context would be lost, leaving only the stone itself as evidence. Understanding this shift helps explain why the Sphinx feels out of place not only in time, but in climate. It belongs to a landscape of rain and runoff, not one of sandstorms and drought. Its body remembers water even as it stands surrounded by desert. This does not require the Sphinx to be unimaginably ancient. It requires only that it predates the final stabilization of arid conditions in the region. Even a difference of a few thousand years would place it in a fundamentally different environmental world. Such a difference matters. Climate shapes culture. It influences settlement patterns, beliefs, and priorities. A monument born in a wet landscape would reflect different concerns than one born in a dry one. Its orientation, form, and placement would make sense within that older context. As the desert expanded and the memory of rain faded, the Sphinx would remain increasingly anomalous. It would stand as a relic of a climate that no longer existed, maintained by people who no longer shared the assumptions that shaped it. This gradual mismatch between monument and environment contributes to the sense of age that surrounds the Sphinx. It feels older not only because of its wear, but because it belongs to a world that has vanished. The land around it changed, but the stone did not follow. The Sphinx's weathering marks are therefore not merely signs of erosion. They are evidence of a forgotten relationship between stone and water. They suggest a time when the sky above Giza behaved differently, when rain was part of the rhythm of life rather than a rare disruption. Recognizing this does not solve the mystery of the Sphinx. It deepens it. It places the monument within a longer environmental narrative, one that stretches beyond dynasties and written history. It invites attention away from names and toward processes that unfold slowly, shaping both land and culture. As the exploration continues, this environmental context will remain essential. This Sphinx cannot be understood in isolation from the climate that shaped it. Water, rain, and memory are etched into its body, quietly testifying to a time Egypt no longer remembers, but stone still does. By the time the first massive stone blocks were hauled into place and the pyramids began to rise, the ground beneath them was not new, neutral, or unused. The Giza plateau was already old, not just geologically, which is true of almost any landscape, but culturally and symbolically. It had already been shaped by time, climate, and human presence long before it became the stage for Egypt's most famous monuments. The pyramids did not arrive on an untouched canvas. They arrived at a place that had already been chosen, returned to, and quietly marked by earlier generations whose names have not survived. The plateau itself is a broad limestone outcrop overlooking the Nile floodplain. Its elevation keeps it above the reach of seasonal floods, while its proximity keeps it connected to the river's lifeblood. This combination alone would have made it significant to early human groups. High ground near water is never accidental in human settlement patterns. It offers safety, visibility, and symbolic distance from the cycles of inundation below. Long before kings sought eternal resting places, people would have recognized the plateau as a stable and meaningful location. Archaeological traces across the wider Giza region suggest intermittent human activity stretching back far earlier than the Old Kingdom. Stone tools, habitation sites, and quarry marks indicate that people were moving through, working, and understanding this landscape in deep prehistory. These were not builders of pyramids, but they were not strangers to stone, land, or long-term planning either. They selected places carefully, returned to familiar ground, and invested effort where it mattered. The idea that monumental construction only begins with dynastic Egypt overlooks a broader pattern seen across the world. Long before centralized states, humans marked landscapes with stone. Sometimes these markings were subtle, sometimes they were massive. They did not always serve the same purposes as later monuments, but they were no less intentional. A plateau that commands the horizon and overlooks a vital river would not go unnoticed for thousands of years and then suddenly become important by chance. The Giza plateau shows signs of having been worked before the pyramids were built. Quarrying scars cut into the limestone suggest that stone was extracted here prior to large-scale pyramid construction. Some of these quarries may have been reused or expanded later, but their existence points to an earlier phase of activity. Stone was already being removed, shaped, and transported before royal architecture dominated the site. This matters because quarrying is not casual labour. It reflects planning, knowledge of material properties, and an understanding of how stone behaves. It suggests that the plateau was already valued as a resource, and perhaps as a place with meaning attached to it. Resources and meanings often overlap. A place that provides useful stone can also provide symbolic weight. The Sphinx sits at the heart of this overlap. Carved directly from the bedrock, it is inseparable from the plateau itself. Unlike the pyramids, which are constructed from blocks assembled atop the ground, the Sphinx is the ground reshaped. This distinction is critical. Structures that rise above the land assert control over it. Structures carved into it suggest engagement with what is already there. They imply continuity rather than imposition. If the Sphinx was present before pyramid construction began, then the plateau was already marked in a profound way. It was not simply a convenient building site. It was a place with a focal point, a presence that would influence how later builders understood and used the space. The pyramids would then be additions to an existing sacred or significant landscape, rather than its origin. This idea aligns with how ancient cultures often treated meaningful locations. Sacred sites were rarely abandoned when new belief systems emerged. They were reinterpreted, expanded, and incorporated. New monuments were placed nearby to tap into existing significance. The past was not erased, it was layered. The alignment of the pyramids themselves may reflect this layering. Their placement relative to the plateau, the Nile, and the sky suggests careful consideration of both geography and cosmology. If the plateau already held meaning, builders would have been responding not only to abstract ideals, but to the presence of something already there. The Sphinx, oriented toward the rising sun, would naturally become part of this dialogue between land and sky. The plateau's age is also evident in its weathered surface. The limestone shows signs of exposure that predate the pyramids. Natural fissures, erosion patterns, and ancient runoff channels are visible across the site. These features were not created by pyramid construction. They were inherited. Builders worked around them, sometimes incorporating them into their designs rather than erasing them. This inherited landscape would have carried memory even without writing. Paths worn into stone, cut faces exposed by quarrying, and carved forms left behind would all serve as reminders of earlier activity. Later builders would encounter these traces and make choices about how to respond. Ignoring them entirely would be difficult. Incorporating them would be natural. The pyramids themselves reflect a desire for permanence that may have been inspired by what already endured on the plateau. A structure like the Sphinx, carved from bedrock and weathered by centuries or millennia, would stand as proof that stone could outlast generations. It would embody the very endurance that pyramid builders sought to achieve. In this sense, the Sphinx may have functioned as an anchor, a demonstration of what it meant to exist across deep time. The pyramids, though larger and more precise, were constructed rather than revealed. They aspired to the same longevity, but they were new. The plateau already held something that had passed through earlier cycles of climate and culture. The idea that the plateau was ancient even by Old Kingdom standards helps explain why pyramid builders chose this location so decisively. There were other places along the Nile where pyramids could have been built, yet Giza became the focus of an extraordinary concentration of effort. This suggests more than convenience, it suggests significance. Significance often accumulates slowly. A place becomes important because people return to it repeatedly, each time adding meaning. Over centuries the reasons may change, but the pull remains. By the time pyramids were conceived, the plateau may already have been such a place, known not only for its stone but for its presence. This perspective also reframes the relationship between the Sphinx and the pyramids. Instead of seeing the Sphinx as an accessory to the pyramid complex, it becomes the older resident. The pyramids arrive later, arranging themselves around an existing landmark. This would invert the usual hierarchy, placing the Sphinx not as a subordinate guardian, but as a central reference point. Such an inversion does not diminish the pyramids, it contextualizes them. It suggests that Egypt's most iconic achievements did not emerge in isolation, but in conversation with a deeper past. The builders of the pyramids were not inventing monumentality from nothing. They were responding to a landscape already shaped by monumental thought. The plateau's antiquity also helps explain why later Egyptians treated the Sphinx with such reverence. Clearing sand, restoring damage, and integrating it into religious narratives would make sense if the monument was already perceived as ancient. Age itself carried authority in Egyptian culture. What endured was respected. Records from later periods indicate that the Sphinx was associated with the sun god and with concepts of kingship and protection. These associations may not reflect its original purpose, but they show how the monument was absorbed into evolving belief systems. An already ancient structure would naturally attract reinterpretation rather than replacement. The silence of the plateau before the pyramids is not evidence of emptiness. It is evidence of a kind of history that does not speak through texts. Stoneworking, landscape modification, and symbolic placement can occur without leaving written records. When writing later appears, it tends to focus on contemporary concerns rather than preserving distant origins. The pyramids themselves are rich in symbolism, but they say little about why Giza was chosen in the first place. That choice is often taken for granted, as if the plateau existed solely to host them. Yet the land had its own story long before royal architecture arrived. Understanding the plateau as already ancient encourages a different way of reading the site. Instead of asking only what the pyramids mean, it becomes important to ask what they responded to. What was already there that made this place suitable for such an ambitious expression of permanence? The Sphinx, weathered and grounded, provides a compelling answer. It embodies endurance without inscription. It shows how stone can carry meaning across climatic and cultural shifts. It stands as proof that the plateau was not waiting to be discovered by pharaohs. It was already part of a longer human relationship with the land. This longer relationship likely involved repeated visits, seasonal use, and gradual investment rather than sudden transformation. Over time, certain features would stand out. High points, unusual rock formations, carved shapes, and aligned structures would attract attention and ritual significance. The plateau would become a place where the past was felt rather than recorded. When dynastic Egypt emerged with its emphasis on order, continuity, and cosmic balance, it would naturally gravitate towards such places. They offered a sense of legitimacy rooted in time itself. Building there was not just practical, it was symbolic. The pyramids can thus be seen as a declaration made in a place already saturated with meaning. They did not create the plateau's significance, they amplified it. They translated an older, quieter importance into a new architectural language. This translation did not erase what came before. The Sphinx remained, partly buried, partly restored, always present. It did not need to be rebuilt because it already fulfilled its role as a marker of deep time. The pyramids rose around it, monumental and precise, but they did not replace it. Seeing the plateau this way helps resolve some of the tension between the Sphinx and its surroundings. The sense that it feels older than the pyramids may not be an illusion. It may reflect reality. The land itself, shaped by ancient climates and early human presence, provided the foundation upon which later monuments were added. This layered history is easy to miss because the pyramids dominate attention. Their scale and symmetry draw the eye upward and outward. The plateau beneath them fades into the background. Yet without that plateau, without its age, stability and accumulated meaning, the pyramids would be unthinkable. The Sphinx keeps the memory of that deeper layer alive. It does not explain it. It simply occupies it. Its presence reminds us that even the most celebrated achievements stand on ground that has lived many lives before them. As attention continues to move forward, the focus naturally turns from the land itself to the historical record. If the plateau was already ancient, how did later Egyptians speak about it? What did they choose to say, and what did they leave unsaid? The absence of certain explanations may be as revealing as the monuments that remain. When a civilization leaves behind as much writing as ancient Egypt did, silence becomes noticeable. Walls are covered with inscriptions. Tombs speak in spells and declarations. Stelae announce victories, dedications, restorations and lineages with meticulous care. Kings ensured their names endured. Gods were named, renamed, and described in exhaustive detail. Against this background of abundance, what is not said carries its own weight. The Sphinx exists squarely within that silence. There is no creation inscription for the Sphinx, no foundational text carved at its base, no surviving account that describes its construction, its original purpose, or the moment it first emerged from the limestone. This absence is striking not because Egypt lacked the ability or habit of recording such things, but because it excelled at doing so. When temples were built, their builders were named. When statues were commissioned, their patrons were identified. When restorations occurred, they were celebrated. The Sphinx stands apart from this pattern. The earliest Egyptian texts that mention the Sphinx do not describe its origin. They do not recount its carving or name its creator. Instead, they speak of it as something already present, something encountered rather than inaugurated. This subtle distinction matters. Texts that introduce new monuments tend to frame them as achievements. Texts that encounter old ones frame them as inheritances. One of the earliest references comes from the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after the commonly accepted date of the Sphinx's construction. The dream stele of Thutmose IV is often cited as evidence linking the monument to dynastic Egypt, yet the stele does not claim authorship. It describes the Sphinx as buried in sand, neglected and ancient. Thutmose speaks not as a builder, but as a restorer. He clears sand away. He honours what already exists. He does not say, "I built this." He says in effect, "I found this." The language of the dream stele is revealing. The Sphinx is portrayed as a powerful, almost autonomous presence, capable of speaking, promising kingship, and demanding care. It is treated as a being with authority rooted in antiquity, not as a royal monument whose power flows downward from a known king. This framing places the Sphinx outside the usual hierarchy of Egyptian monuments. If the Sphinx had been a recent construction in Khafra's time, it is difficult to explain why later kings would speak of it as ancient. Egyptian texts were precise when it came to lineage and legacy. Kings traced their authority carefully. Claiming connection to a recent monument would have been straightforward. Treating it instead as something buried by time suggests genuine distance. The Old Kingdom texts themselves are notably quiet. Pyramid texts, among the oldest religious writings in the world, are extensive and detailed. They describe the afterlife, the cosmos, the gods, and the king's journey beyond death. They reference sacred locations, celestial landmarks, and mythic geography. Yet they do not describe the Sphinx as a creation of their age. They do not anchor it to a specific pharaoh. This omission is not proof of anything on its own. Texts are selective. Not everything important is recorded. Yet when silence aligns with other forms of ambiguity, it becomes harder to dismiss. The Sphinx occupies a central location in one of the most symbolically charged landscapes of Egypt, yet it remains largely unnamed in the earliest records. Even its name is revealing. The term Sphinx is Greek, applied much later. The ancient Egyptian names associated with the monument vary and appear in later periods. These names reflect interpretation rather than origin. They tell us how later Egyptians understood the Sphinx, not how or when it was created. Naming something centuries after its appearance often signals that its original name, if it had one, was no longer remembered. In Egyptian culture, forgetting a name was significant. Names carried essence and power. To lose a name was to lose a part of identity. The fact that the Sphinx's original name is unknown suggests that it belonged to a period beyond the reach of written memory. This is unusual for a civilization that took such care to preserve names. The absence of construction records is equally notable. Major projects in ancient Egypt required organization, labor, and resources. These efforts were often recorded indirectly through administrative texts, labor accounts, or commemorative inscriptions. While not all records survive, patterns do. The pyramids leave behind a trail of documentation, from quarry marks to worker villages. The Sphinx does not leave the same trail. This disparity has often been explained by proximity. The Sphinx is said to be part of Khafra's complex, and therefore its records may have been absorbed into the broader narrative. Yet absorption does not typically result in total silence. Even ancillary structures are usually mentioned somewhere. The Sphinx's near invisibility in early texts remains difficult to reconcile. Later Egyptian writings treat the Sphinx with reverence rather than familiarity. It is associated with the sun god, with guardianship, with liminal power. These associations feel layered, as though meaning was added gradually rather than inherited intact. This is consistent with the treatment of objects whose origins are no longer fully understood. They are reinterpreted rather than explained. Egyptian religion was flexible in this way. Deities evolved, symbols merged, sacred objects accumulated roles. When something ancient persisted without a clear origin story, it was often absorbed into theology rather than questioned historically. Myth filled the gaps that history could not. The Sphinx seems to have followed this path. Its presence was undeniable, its age was apparent, its purpose was adaptable. Rather than being explained through history, it was explained through cosmology. It became a guardian, a solar symbol, a manifestation of power tied to the rising sun. These meanings did not require knowledge of its construction. They required only its continued presence. This pattern is important because it suggests that the Sphinx did not need to be explained in practical terms. It was already authoritative by virtue of its endurance. In Egyptian thought, what lasted was aligned with Mat, the principle of order and balance. Ancientness itself conferred legitimacy. If the Sphinx had been built within the dynastic system, its origin would have been a source of pride. Kings advertised their works relentlessly. Silence in such a case would be strange. If, however, the Sphinx predated dynastic Egypt, the silence becomes understandable. One does not easily explain what lies beyond memory. The absence of early textual discussion also shields the Sphinx from being fully claimed. Without a clear builder, no single king owns it historically. This allows it to remain a shared symbol, accessible to multiple generations without being tied to a specific reign. This may explain why it endured without being dismantled or replaced. Egyptian texts are often concerned with beginnings. Creation myths describe the first mound, the first light, the first god, yet the Sphinx does not appear in these narratives as a created thing. It exists alongside them, not within them. This positioning reinforces the sense that it belongs to a different category of being, one that is discovered rather than made. This distinction mirrors the difference between natural sacred sites and constructed temples. Mountains, springs, and stones were often considered inherently sacred, not because humans made them so, but because they already were. The Sphinx, carved yet inseparable from the bedrock, straddles this boundary. It is human-shaped stone that behaves like a natural feature. Texts tend to speak about temples as places built for gods. They speak about natural features as places inhabited by gods. The Sphinx is treated more like the latter. It is addressed, honoured and restored, but not introduced. The lack of early textual clarity has often been treated as a gap to be filled with assumption. The most convenient assumption is that the Sphinx must have been built by a known pharaoh, because that fits the structure of Egyptian history as we understand it. Yet convenience is not evidence. Silence remains silence, regardless of how neatly an assumption fits elsewhere. What the oldest Egyptian texts do not say about the Sphinx is therefore as important as what they say. They do not say who built it. They do not say when it was first carved. They do not celebrate its creation. They do not describe it as new. Instead, they approach it as something already there, something powerful, something deserving of care. This approach suggests respect mixed with distance. It suggests a monument that had already outlived the need for explanation by the time writing took hold. Its story, if it was ever told, had already faded. This does not mean the Egyptians were ignorant of their past. It means their past extended beyond what writing could capture. Writing freezes memory at a particular moment. What came before remains fluid, preserved in stone, land, and ritual rather than in words. The Sphinx occupies that fluid zone. It exists at the edge of history, where material evidence precedes narrative. Its silence in the texts is not an oversight. It is a clue to its position in time. As attention continues forward, this textual silence invites comparison with how other civilizations treated inherited structures. Patterns begin to emerge. When something is old enough, explanation gives way to accommodation. Meaning is layered rather than traced back to origin. The Sphinx appears to have been accommodated rather than explained. It was integrated into Egypt's worldview without being fully claimed by its history. This choice, intentional or not, allowed it to endure without being reduced to a single moment or name. From here, the exploration naturally moves toward the idea of inheritance itself. If early Egyptians encountered the Sphinx as something already ancient, how did they relate to it? How did civilizations adopt, restore, and reinterpret structures they did not create? The answer to that question may offer further insight into why the Sphinx remains both present and unresolved, even now. When civilizations look back at their own beginnings, there is a tendency to imagine clean starts, founding moments, first kings, first cities, first monuments rising from empty ground. This image is comforting because it suggests control, intention, and authorship. Yet history, when examined closely, rarely unfolds that way. Most civilizations inherit far more than they create. They arrive into landscapes already shaped by earlier peoples, already marked by structures, paths, symbols, and memories that do not belong to them alone. Construction often comes later. Inheritance comes first. Early civilizations did not emerge in isolation. They formed where humans had already lived, gathered, worshipped, and marked the land for generations. Rivers, coastlines, plateaus, and crossroads accumulated meaning long before states formalized power. When organised societies appeared, they did not wipe these places clean. They adapted to them. They absorbed them. They built upon what was already there. This pattern appears again and again across the ancient world. Cities rose atop older settlements. Temples were built over earlier shrines. Stones were reused, reshaped, and recontextualized. Sacred landscapes rarely lost their significance when political systems changed. Instead, their meanings evolved. Authority aligned itself with antiquity rather than attempting to replace it. Inheritance served a practical purpose. Older structures represented labour already invested. They offered ready-made focal points for ritual and administration. But inheritance also served a deeper symbolic function. Claiming what already endured connected new rulers to a sense of timelessness. Power rooted in deep time appeared more legitimate than power that announced itself as new. This logic helps explain why early civilizations often restored monuments rather than destroying them. Even when the original builders were forgotten, the structures themselves carried weight. They were treated as gifts from the past rather than obstacles to progress. To inherit a monument was to inherit its authority, even if its original meaning was no longer fully understood. Ancient Egypt fits squarely within this pattern. Despite its reputation for monumental innovation, Egypt was deeply conservative in how it treated the past. Older religious symbols were preserved. Ancestral kings were venerated. Sacred sites were maintained across dynasties. Restoration was an act of piety, not an admission of uncertainty. This conservatism extended beyond Egypt. In Mesopotamia, temples were rebuilt on the same foundations for thousands of years. Each rebuilding acknowledged what came before. In the Andes, Inca rulers incorporated older sacred sites into their imperial system. In the Mediterranean, Greek temples rose atop Mycenaean ruins. In each case, authority grew by aligning itself with inheritance. The reason for this is simple. People trust what has endured. Structures that survive across generations appear to possess qualities beyond human control. They seem anchored to the land itself. By associating with them, rulers gained legitimacy that no proclamation could provide. Inheritance also allows for flexibility. When the origin of a structure is unclear, it can be reinterpreted. Meanings can shift to suit new beliefs. A stone carved for one purpose can serve another without losing its power. Ambiguity becomes an asset rather than a problem. This flexibility is especially valuable during periods of transition. When societies reorganize, they seek continuity to stabilize change. Inherited monuments provide that continuity. They act as bridges between worlds, allowing new systems to root themselves in older ground. The Sphinx fits naturally into this framework. If it existed before dynastic Egypt, it would have presented early Egyptians with a powerful inheritance. A massive, enduring form carved into the bedrock would demand attention. It would not need explanation to command respect. Its presence alone would justify incorporation rather than replacement. In such a scenario, the question would not be whether to keep the Sphinx, but how to integrate it. What role should it play in a worldview now organised around kingship, gods, and cosmic order? The answer would not require knowing who built it. It would require deciding what it meant now. This decision-making process would naturally lead to adaptation. The Sphinx's form could be adjusted to align with emerging symbols of authority. A head might be reshaped to resemble a ruler or deity. Associations with the sun could be emphasized. Ritual significance could be layered onto an older structure without erasing its physical core. This kind of adaptation leaves traces. Proportions shift, styles overlap, surfaces carry different histories. The monument becomes composite, not because of confusion, but because of continuity. Each generation leaves its mark while preserving what it inherits. The Sphinx's body and head appear to reflect precisely this process. The grounded animal body suggests an earlier symbolic language focused on strength, guardianship, and the land. The refined head suggests a later language of identity, kingship, and divine authority. Together they form a structure that carries multiple cultural moments within a single form. This composite nature is not a flaw, it is evidence of use. Monuments that remain relevant are those that can be reinterpreted. Those that resist adaptation are often abandoned. The Sphinx endured because it could change without losing itself. Inheritance also explains the absence of origin stories. When a monument is inherited, its creation is not celebrated in contemporary records because it did not occur within that generation's memory. Instead, attention focuses on maintenance, restoration, and ritual engagement. Texts speak of caring for the monument, not creating it. This pattern appears clearly in Egyptian records. When later pharaohs restored older temples or statues, they commemorated the act of restoration, not the original construction. The original builders were sometimes unknown, and that ignorance did not diminish the monument's importance. On the contrary, age itself enhanced its authority. The Sphinx's silence in early texts aligns with this practice. It is treated as something that needs attention, not explanation. It is honoured, not introduced. This suggests that its presence was already accepted as part of the sacred landscape. Inheritance also affects how labour and resources are allocated. Building something entirely new requires justification. Maintaining something inherited does not. The decision to invest in preserving the Sphinx across centuries implies that it held ongoing value independent of its origin. This value likely stemmed from its placement as much as its form. The Sphinx occupies a liminal space between desert and floodplain, earth and sky, animal and human. Such liminality is often associated with guardianship and transition. These themes are ancient and cross-cultural. They do not belong exclusively to dynastic theology. Early civilizations were particularly attentive to such thresholds. They understood that boundaries mattered. Monuments placed at boundaries served to mediate forces, mark territory, or symbolize protection. A structure like the Sphinx would naturally attract such interpretations regardless of who carved it. Inheritance also encourages restraint. When something is old enough, it inspires caution. Alterations are made carefully. Destruction feels risky. The Sphinx shows signs of careful modification rather than wholesale transformation. Its body remains largely intact. Changes are concentrated where symbolic alignment was most needed. This restraint suggests respect. It implies that the monument was not seen as raw material to be reshaped at will, but as something that demanded preservation. Respect of this kind is typically reserved for inherited sacred objects rather than newly commissioned works. The broader implication is that early civilizations were less concerned with authorship than modern narratives assume. Who built something mattered less than what it did and how long it had endured. Identity was collective and cumulative rather than individual and proprietary. This perspective challenges modern expectations. We often seek names, dates, and builders because we value originality and invention. Ancient cultures valued continuity and survival. A monument that outlasted generations was more meaningful than one that announced novelty. The Sphinx embodies this ancient value system. It does not declare itself new. It does not bear the stamp of a single ruler's ambition. It exists as something already there, something to be reckoned with rather than created. Understanding this helps resolve some of the tension surrounding its origin. The question may not be why Egyptians failed to record its construction, but why they would have needed to. If the Sphinx belonged to a deeper past, recording its origin may have been impossible or irrelevant. What mattered was its role in the present, how it fit into the cosmic order, how it protected sacred space, how it aligned with the rising sun. These functions could be defined without knowing its beginning. Inheritance also allows monuments to accumulate myth. Over time, stories gather around objects whose origins are unclear. These stories do not aim to preserve history. They aim to preserve meaning. The Sphinx's later associations with gods and kings reflect this process. Rather than seeing these myths as distortions, they can be understood as layers. Each layer represents an attempt to relate to something already ancient. Meaning shifts, but presence remains. This layered inheritance makes the Sphinx resilient. It survives not because it is understood, but because it is useful. It continues to offer a point of connection between land, sky, and society. It continues to anchor meaning even as beliefs change. Early civilizations depended on such anchors. In times of uncertainty, continuity mattered more than explanation. Structures that endured provided reassurance that order persisted beyond individual lives and political systems. The Sphinx, carved into bedrock and shaped by time, would have embodied this reassurance powerfully. It would have appeared as something that outlasted climate shifts, cultural transformations, and forgotten generations. To inherit such a monument would be to inherit stability itself. This helps explain why the Sphinx was never replaced. Even when new monuments rose nearby, none attempted to supersede it directly. The pyramids did not replicate its form, they complemented it. Each served a different function within the same landscape. Inheritance does not eliminate innovation, it frames it. The pyramids represent innovation within an inherited context. They express a new vision of permanence using an old language of stone and landscape. Seen this way, the Sphinx is not an anomaly. It is a precedent. It shows that monumentality existed before dynastic power formalized it. The pyramids then took that impulse and refined it into a system. This continuity between inherited and constructed monuments reveals a civilization deeply aware of time. Egypt did not see itself as beginning history. It saw itself as maintaining order within an ongoing world. The past was not behind it. It was beneath it. The Sphinx occupies that beneath space. It is the inherited foundation upon which later expressions of power were built. Its age is not a challenge to Egyptian achievement. It is part of its context. Understanding inheritance rather than construction shifts the focus away from questions of capability and toward questions of relationship. It asks not how something was built, but how it was received. Not who made it, but who chose to keep it. As attention continues forward, this idea of inheritance opens new possibilities. If the Sphinx was inherited, then early Egyptians were not alone in this practice. Other cultures may have done the same, adopting structures whose origins lay beyond memory. From here, the exploration naturally moves toward the idea of lost cultural phases and forgotten builders, not as advanced or mythical beings, but as ordinary human societies whose stories were not written down. Their traces remain in stone and land, waiting not to be discovered, but to be recognized for what they are. Long before exile became a story told with names, borders, and destinations, wandering was simply how humans existed in the world. It was not punishment or loss, it was rhythm. Movement followed water, seasons, animals, and weather, long before it followed laws or kings. To wander was not to be displaced. It was to belong to a landscape that was itself changing. This deeper meaning of wandering is essential to understanding how early people related to land, memory, and the structures they left behind. In the modern imagination, wandering is often framed as a deviation from stability. We think of settlement as normal and movement as disruption. Ancient societies experienced this relationship very differently. Stability was rare and temporary. Movement was expected. Even when people returned to the same places repeatedly, they did so through cycles rather than permanence. Camps became familiar, paths became known. Certain locations acquired a meaning not because people stayed there forever, but because they came back. Before dynasties and borders, the Nile Valley and the surrounding regions were part of a broader network of seasonal movement. Human groups shifted between high ground and floodplain, between open grasslands and sheltered areas, responding to rainfall patterns that no longer exist today. These movements were not aimless. They were informed by deep knowledge of the land passed down through memory rather than maps. Wandering in this sense created relationships with places that were episodic rather than permanent. A plateau might be visited at certain times of year. A river bend might serve as a gathering place during floods. High ground might become significant not because people lived there continuously, but because it remained accessible and reliable across changing conditions. This kind of relationship encourages marking rather than building. When people know they will return, but not stay indefinitely, they leave signs. They carve, stack, align, or shape elements of the landscape to signal meaning. These marks are not always homes or cities. They are anchors. They say, in effect, this place matters, even when we are not here. Stone is particularly suited to this purpose. It does not decay quickly. It does not move. It remains visible across generations of wandering. Early societies understood this intuitively. Stone circles, carved figures, and modified outcrops appear again and again in contexts where permanent settlement was not yet established. These structures do not indicate sedentary life. They indicate return. The Sphinx fits comfortably within this pattern. Carved into bedrock, visible from a distance and positioned near a life-sustaining river, it would have served as a fixed point in a moving world. It would not need to house people or store grain. Its role would be to remain, to be encountered repeatedly by those who pass through season after season. This reframes the idea of monumentality. Monument does not have to mean permanence of occupation. It can mean permanence of presence. A structure can exist to be seen, not lived in, to orient movement rather than replace it. In such a context, wandering is not the opposite of civilization. It is its precursor. The knowledge required to move successfully across a landscape is extensive. It includes understanding weather patterns, animal behavior, plant cycles, and terrain. This knowledge creates culture long before it creates cities. As climates shifted and wetter phases gave way to drier ones, patterns of wandering would have changed. Routes would narrow. Populations would cluster closer to reliable water sources. The Nile would become increasingly central. Over time, seasonal movement would compress into localized cycles, eventually giving rise to permanent settlements. But the memory of wandering would not vanish immediately. It would persist in stories, rituals, and symbolic structures. Places that once served as waypoints or gathering points would retain significance even as lifestyles changed. They would become fixed references to a time when movement defined existence. This transition from wandering to settlement is not a clean break. It is gradual and uneven. Some groups settle earlier, others continue moving. For long periods, both modes coexist. During these transitions, inherited structures become especially important. They provide continuity amid change. The Sphinx, if it originated during or before such a transitional period, would embody this continuity. It would not belong exclusively to settled life or wandering life. It would bridge them. It would stand as something encountered by moving groups and later reinterpreted by settled ones. This helps explain why the Sphinx resists being neatly classified as a funerary monument or royal symbol. Those roles emerge clearly only within settled hierarchical societies. As monuments shaped during a period of wandering would serve a different function. It would mark a place rather than a person. It would outlast individual identities. Wandering cultures often encode memory spatially rather than textually. Without writing, history is preserved through routes, landmarks, and repeated encounters. A carved figure becomes a memory aid. It reminds people of shared stories, agreements, or cosmological understandings tied to that place. Such markers do not need explanation carved into them. Their meaning is renewed through use. Each time a group returns, the monument is reactivated through ritual, storytelling, or simple recognition. Meaning lives in practice rather than inscription. As settlement increases and writing emerges, these spatial memories begin to lose context. People encounter the marker without knowing the full story behind it. The monument remains, but its original role shifts. It becomes mysterious, authoritative, or sacred in a new way. This process does not diminish the monument. It elevates it. What is no longer fully understood becomes powerful. It resists being reduced to utility. It acquires myth. The Sphinx's later associations with guardianship, kingship, and divine authority may reflect this transformation. A structure once tied to wandering memory becomes absorbed into settled ideology. It is given new meanings that align with the values of permanence, order, and hierarchy. Yet traces of its earlier role remain in its form. Its horizontal posture, its integration with the land, its lack of interior space all suggest a monument meant to be encountered rather than inhabited. It does not enclose, it observes. Wandering as a theme also helps explain why the Sphinx faces the horizon rather than the interior of the necropolis. It looks outward, toward the rising sun and the broader landscape, not inward toward tombs. This orientation makes sense for a structure meant to mark a place within a moving world. Later interpretations reframe this orientation cosmologically, tying it to solar worship. That meaning is not incorrect. It is layered. The sun has always mattered to wandering cultures. It governs direction, time, and season. Facing the sunrise does not require dynastic theology. It requires only life lived outdoors. In this sense, the Sphinx's alignment may preserve an older relationship with the sky, one rooted in navigation and cyclical return rather than ritual procession. The sun rises, people return. The monument witnesses both. The concept of exile emerges much later, when land becomes owned, borders are enforced, and movement is restricted. Exile is meaningful only when settlement is the norm. Before that, wandering is not loss. It is continuity. Understanding this distinction is important because later stories often project settled values backward in time. Movement is interpreted as displacement. Lack of cities is interpreted as absence. These interpretations obscure the sophistication of earlier ways of life. Early wandering societies were not waiting to become settled. They were adapted to their environments as they existed at the time. When environments changed, societies changed with them. Settlement was one adaptation among many, not an inevitable goal. The Sphinx may belong to this earlier adaptive phase. Its creation would not signal the rise of a state, but the recognition of a place. Its endurance would reflect the importance of continuity across movement rather than control over territory. As dynastic Egypt formed, the meaning of wandering shifted. Movement became regulated, boundaries hardened. The past was reorganized into a narrative of kings and gods. Structures inherited from wandering cultures would be reinterpreted within this new framework. This reinterpretation does not erase their origin. It obscures it. The monument remains, but the story changes. Over time, the new story becomes dominant and the older one fades. The silence of early texts about the Sphinx's construction fits this pattern. If the monument belonged to a time before writing and before settled identity, its origin would not fit neatly into dynastic historiography. It would be easier to treat it as always having been there. Wandering leaves few records because it relies on memory carried in people rather than objects. When those people settle or disappear, the memory travels with them or vanishes. What remains are the markers they left behind. The Sphinx may be one such marker, not a record of exile but a record of return, not a monument to loss but to continuity. This perspective also explains why the Sphinx feels timeless rather than historical. It does not belong to a specific event, it belongs to a pattern. Patterns endure longer than moments. As climates shifted and wandering narrowed into settlement, the meaning of the Sphinx would have shifted as well. Yet its physical presence would continue to anchor memory in the land, even as the stories around it evolved. This anchoring role becomes more apparent when considering how later civilizations encountered inherited monuments. They did not ask why wandering had once been necessary. They asked how the monument could serve their present needs. The Sphinx was absorbed into a new world without being remade entirely. Its body remained. Its head may have changed. Its role expanded. This is how inheritance works when wandering gives way to settlement. Wandering as a theme long before exile invites a gentler reading of the past. It removes the need for dramatic disappearance or catastrophe. It allows for gradual change, adaptation, and layering of meaning. The Sphinx, viewed through this lens, becomes less an anomaly and more a survivor. It carries within it the memory of a world organised around movement rather than permanence, a world that no longer exists but is not entirely forgotten. As the exploration continues, this idea of survival without narration becomes increasingly important. What remains when cultures move on? How stone preserves what people cannot? How landscapes remember patterns long after names are gone? From here, attention naturally shifts toward how memory itself is preserved when writing is absent. How stone, land, and repeated interaction serve as archives of human experience. The Sphinx stands as one such archive, not of exile, but of wandering as a fundamental way of being long before it was ever framed as loss. When later Egyptians encountered the Sphinx, they did not meet it as a blank surface awaiting meaning. They met it as something already present, already shaped, already weathered, already significant. The choices they made in response to it reveal more about restoration than creation, about care rather than authorship. These choices were not hesitant or confused. They were deliberate, guided by a worldview that placed enormous value on continuity, balance, and the preservation of what time had already sanctioned. In Egyptian thought, the past was not a closed chapter. It was a living foundation. What endured was aligned with Mat, the principle of cosmic order. Structures that survived generations were not simply old, they were validated by time itself. To maintain them was to participate in order. To neglect them was to risk imbalance. This belief shaped how Egyptians treated monuments they inherited, especially those whose origins lay beyond clear memory. The Sphinx fits this pattern with remarkable precision. Later Egyptians did not leave inscriptions boasting of its construction. They left records of clearing sand, repairing damage, and honouring its presence. Their actions speak through restraint. They chose to preserve the monument rather than replace it, to integrate it rather than redefine it entirely. Restoration is a different mindset from construction. Construction begins with an idea imposed upon material. Restoration begins with material that already carries meaning. It requires humility before what exists. It accepts limits. It works around constraints rather than erasing them. The physical state of the Sphinx suggests exactly this kind of engagement. By the time of the New Kingdom, the Sphinx was already heavily eroded and partially buried. Sand had accumulated around its body, obscuring much of its form. This burial did not happen quickly. It was the result of centuries of gradual accumulation. The fact that later Egyptians found it buried indicates that it had stood long enough for the desert itself to reclaim it repeatedly. When Pharaoh Thutmose IV cleared the sand, his actions were framed as restoration, not revelation. The dream stele presents the Sphinx as an ancient power, capable of granting kingship but demanding care in return. This relationship is not that of creator to creation. It is that of steward to inheritance. The language of stewardship is consistent across Egyptian history. Temples were restored rather than demolished. Older statues were repaired rather than discarded. Even when gods evolved and religious emphases shifted, physical structures were rarely erased. They were adapted. Layers were added. Meaning was reinterpreted, but the core was preserved. This approach makes sense in a culture that viewed time as cyclical rather than linear. Creation myths emphasized repetition, renewal, and return. The world was continually maintained against chaos, not invented anew with each generation. Restoring an ancient monument fits seamlessly into this worldview. The physical evidence at the Sphinx supports this interpretation. Blocks of stone added to stabilize eroded sections are visibly different from the original bedrock. Repairs are localized, careful, and respectful of the existing form. They do not attempt to reshape the monument completely. They aim to support what remains. If the Sphinx had been a dynastic creation, one might expect later rulers to modify it more aggressively. New faces could have been carved, inscriptions could have been added, symbols could have been imposed to assert ownership. Instead, changes are minimal. The monument's essential character remains intact. This restraint suggests that later Egyptians perceived limits, not technical limits, but cultural ones. Some things were not meant to be overwritten. Some forms carried authority precisely because they were ancient and anonymous. Altering them too much would risk breaking their connection to deep time. Restoration also implies recognition of value beyond utility. The Sphinx did not house priests or store goods. It did not function as infrastructure. Its value was symbolic and spatial. Preserving it required resources with no immediate practical return. Such investment indicates belief in its importance beyond economics. The orientation of the Sphinx may have reinforced this belief. Facing the rising sun, it aligned naturally with solar theology that became prominent in later periods. This alignment would have made it easy to incorporate the monument into evolving religious frameworks without needing to change its physical form. In this way, restoration becomes an act of translation rather than invention. The Sphinx's meaning was adjusted to fit new narratives, but its body was left largely as it was. This balance allowed the monument to remain relevant while retaining its ancient authority. The idea that later Egyptians restored rather than created the Sphinx also helps explain inconsistencies in attribution. Some scholars link it to Khafra based on proximity and stylistic interpretation. Yet no inscription confirms this. Restoration does not require ownership. It requires responsibility. A ruler could restore a monument without claiming to have built it. This distinction matters because modern narratives often conflate association with authorship. Ancient cultures did not always do so. Being responsible for a monument's care did not automatically mean being responsible for its origin. In fact, claiming authorship of something truly ancient could undermine its power. If a monument's authority derived from time immemorial, tying it to a recent ruler would diminish that authority. Leaving its origin undefined allowed it to remain timeless. This strategy appears elsewhere in Egyptian culture. Certain sacred sites were associated with gods without clear creation stories. Their power came from presence, not origin. The Sphinx fits comfortably within this category. The practice of restoration also reflects practical awareness of environmental change. As the climate dried and sand encroached, older monuments became vulnerable. Clearing sand and reinforcing stone were necessary acts to preserve what had already survived earlier conditions. These efforts show that Egyptians recognized the monument's age and fragility. If the Sphinx had been newly built in dynastic times, its rapid burial and erosion would be puzzling. Stone monuments do not deteriorate so quickly under stable conditions. The need for early restoration implies long prior exposure. The cumulative effect of repeated restorations adds to the monument's layered character. Each intervention left subtle traces without altering the overall form. Over time, these traces became part of the monument's history, further distancing it from any single moment of creation. Restoration also suggests acceptance of incompleteness. The Sphinx was never returned to a pristine state. Erosion was slowed, not reversed. Sand was cleared, but burial recurred. This acceptance aligns with a worldview that understood time as a force to be managed, not defeated. The Egyptians did not attempt to return the Sphinx to some imagined original condition. They worked with what remained. This approach implies that the original condition was either unknown or irrelevant. What mattered was the monument's continued presence and function. This attitude contrasts sharply with how dynastic Egyptians treated their own creations. New temples were built with precision and maintained meticulously. Inscriptions were refreshed. Damage was corrected to preserve intended form. The Sphinx received care but not perfection. Such differential treatment suggests different categories of monument. The Sphinx belonged to a category defined by antiquity and inheritance, rather than by design and authorship. Restoration rather than creation also explains why the Sphinx was never duplicated. Egyptian art is rich in repetition. Forms that mattered were reproduced widely. The Sphinx remained unique. It was not a template, it was a singular presence. Uniqueness often signals inheritance. Objects that cannot be replicated easily are treated as exceptional. Their value lies in their singularity. The Sphinx's uniqueness supports the idea that it was not conceived as part of a replicable program of royal art. The decision to restore rather than rebuild also reflects a pragmatic understanding of limits. Carving a structure of that scale into bedrock is an enormous undertaking. Repeating it would require extraordinary justification. Maintaining what already existed was more sensible and symbolically powerful. Over time, restoration itself became part of the Sphinx's identity. Each generation that cleared sand or repaired stone reaffirmed its importance. The monument became a continuous project, linking rulers across centuries through shared responsibility. This continuity would have reinforced the perception that the Sphinx belonged to the land rather than to any one ruler. It was a fixture of the landscape like the Nile or the plateau itself. Caring for it was part of maintaining order. The idea that later Egyptians restored rather than created the Sphinx does not diminish their achievements. It highlights a different kind of sophistication. Recognizing value in what one did not make requires discernment. Preserving it requires commitment. This perspective also softens the need for dramatic explanations. The Sphinx does not need to be attributed to a lost advanced civilization or extraordinary technology. It needs only to be placed earlier in a long continuum of human interaction with the landscape. Early societies shaped stone, later societies preserved it. Both contributed to what we see today. The monument we encounter is not the product of a single moment, but of sustained attention across deep time. Understanding this helps reconcile the monument's physical inconsistencies. Different parts bear different histories because they were shaped and cared for under different conditions. The body endured water and time. The head endured reshaping and interpretation. Restoration bridged these phases without erasing either. The Sphinx thus becomes an example of how civilizations relate to their pasts not by replacing them, but by living with them. It shows how memory can be preserved through maintenance rather than narration. As attention continues forward, the focus naturally shifts toward what this inherited monument might have meant to those who first encountered it as ancient. What kinds of knowledge or warnings might have been embedded in such a structure? What it means to preserve something whose origin is unknown but whose presence is undeniable. The act of restoration is itself a message. It says this matters, even if we do not fully understand why. It says some things are worth keeping simply because they have lasted. The Sphinx stands today not because it was built once, but because it was restored again and again, each time reaffirmed as something that belonged not to a single era, but to time itself. Before writing fixed memory into symbols, before words could be carved to resist forgetting, humans relied on other ways to carry knowledge forward. Memory lived in movement, in repetition, in story, and in place. Certain locations became anchors for shared understanding. Certain objects became reminders not because they spoke, but because they endured. Stone, above all, became a vessel for memory long before it became a surface for text. In a world without writing, remembering was not about recording exact details. It was about continuity. Knowledge was preserved through practice rather than description. People remembered when to return to certain places, how to move through landscapes where water gathered, where the sun rose at particular times of year. Memory was spatial, rhythmic, and embodied. It lived in paths walked repeatedly, and in landmarks encountered again and again. Stone plays a crucial role in this kind of memory because it does not change quickly. Trees grow and die, Rivers shift course, camps are dismantled, stone remains. When humans modify stone, even subtly, they create points of reference that can outlast generations. These modifications do not need to be elaborate to be meaningful. A carved shape, an altered outcrop, or a worked surface can hold significance simply by persisting. This is why some of the oldest known human-made structures appear long before writing. They are not archives of words, they are archives of attention. They mark places where meaning accumulated through repeated use. Their significance was renewed each time people returned, not explained anew. The Sphinx fits this pattern of pre-literate memory preservation with striking clarity. It does not tell a story in sentences. It does not explain itself. It simply exists, shaped into a recognizable form that demands recognition. Its meaning would not have been transmitted through text, but through encounter. For wandering and semi-settled societies, such encounters were essential. Returning to a known landmark confirmed orientation, both physically and culturally. It reminded people that they were still within a familiar world, even as conditions changed. A large stone figure carved into bedrock would serve this function powerfully. It would be visible, unmistakable, and difficult to ignore. Memory preserved in stone is different from memory preserved in writing. Writing fixes meaning at a particular moment. Stone allows meaning to evolve. Each generation can encounter the same form and understand it slightly differently, while still recognizing its importance. This flexibility is an advantage in long-term cultural continuity. When writing finally emerges, it does not replace stone-based memory immediately. It overlays it. Early writing often focuses on administration, ownership, and ritual formulae. Deeper cultural meanings continue to reside in places and objects. Writing describes what matters now. Stone remembers what mattered before. The absence of early writing about the Sphinx may therefore reflect not ignorance, but sufficiency. The monument did not need explanation, because its meaning was already embedded in practice and place. People knew when to clear it, when to honour it, when to return. These actions carried memory forward without words. This kind of memory is resilient. It does not depend on literacy or centralised control. It survives fragmentation because it is distributed across people and land. Even when stories fade, the act of returning can persist. The landmark remains meaningful, even if its original explanation is lost. The Sphinx's integration into the bedrock reinforces this role. It is not an object placed in the landscape. It is part of the landscape. This makes it harder to remove and harder to forget. It becomes a permanent reference point, not a portable artifact. In pre-literate societies, such reference points often encode multiple layers of knowledge. They can mark territory, signal safe passage, or serve as gathering points. They can also carry cosmological significance, aligning with celestial events that help structure time. These functions do not require writing. They require observation and repetition. The Sphinx's orientation toward the rising sun suggests an awareness of cyclical time that predates formal calendars. Watching the sun rise at the same point year after year connects people to seasonal rhythms. A monument aligned with this event reinforces that connection physically. It turns abstract cycles into visible experience. Memory preserved in stone also tends to emphasize continuity over precision. The exact date of carving matters less than the fact that the monument remains. In this framework, age is not counted in years. It is felt in endurance. Something that has always been there feels authoritative regardless of when it was made. This helps explain why later Egyptians treated the Sphinx as ancient without needing to know how ancient. Its authority did not come from documentation. It came from survival. It had passed through enough generations to be accepted as part of the world's structure. Writing, when it appears, often seeks to impose order on memory. It categorizes names and dates. But writing also creates gaps. What is not written down risks being forgotten. Stone-based memory does not operate this way. It does not select. It persists indiscriminately. The Sphinx's silence in writing may therefore be a feature rather than a flaw. It preserves a kind of memory that writing cannot easily capture, a memory tied to presence rather than narrative. This distinction becomes clearer when considering how writing changes perception. Once events are recorded, memory becomes linear. Before writing, memory is cyclical. People remember by returning, not by reading. A monument encountered repeatedly becomes a node in this cycle. The Sphinx would have served as such a node. People would not ask when it was made. They would ask when to visit it, what to do there, how to relate to it. These questions guide practice rather than history. As societies transition toward writing and settlement, these practices shift. Memory becomes more abstract. It moves from land to text. Yet inherited stone markers remain. They are reinterpreted within new frameworks, but their physical presence continues to shape behaviour. This transition can create tension. Writing demands explanation. Stone resists it. The Sphinx sits at this intersection. It persists from a time when memory did not need words into a time when words became dominant. The result is a monument that feels older than history, not because it predates human thought, but because it predates the way humans learn to record thought. It belongs to a mode of memory that is no longer familiar, but not entirely lost. This may explain why modern observers feel unsettled by the Sphinx. We are accustomed to written explanation. When it's absent, we sense a gap. We assume something is missing. In reality, something different is present. The Sphinx does not invite reading. It invites recognition. It asks to be seen, not understood. Its meaning unfolds through attention rather than interpretation. Memory preserved in stone also survives cultural collapse more effectively than memory preserved in text. Libraries burn. Archives decay. Stone remains. Even when its original meaning is lost, its presence continues to influence new cultures. This resilience is evident in how the Sphinx has been absorbed into successive belief systems. Each era finds a way to relate to it without needing to recover its original context fully. This adaptability is a strength. The monument's form is simple enough to allow reinterpretation, yet specific enough to command attention. It is neither abstract nor overly detailed. This balance allows it to function as a memory carrier across deep time. Stone-based memory also tends to emphasize collective identity over individual authorship. There is no signature on the Sphinx, no name to claim it. This anonymity allows many groups to see themselves reflected in it. In a pre-literate world, this anonymity would be natural. Knowledge belonged to the group, not to individuals. Monuments reflected shared understanding rather than personal achievement. The later emergence of kingship and writing introduces a different value system, one that emphasizes names, lineages, and accomplishments. The Sphinx does not conform to this system because it was not born within it. Instead of being a problem, this difference makes the Sphinx valuable. It preserves evidence of an older way of relating to the world, one in which memory was carried through land and form rather than through text. This does not mean that the Sphinx was built with the intention of preserving memory in the modern sense. It means that it fulfilled that role naturally by enduring. Its persistence allowed it to become a memory object regardless of original intent. The question of what exactly it was meant to remember may be less important than the fact that it allowed memory to survive at all. In pre-literate societies, survival of memory depends on physical continuity. The Sphinx provides that continuity. As writing became dominant, some forms of knowledge were recorded, others were not. What was not recorded did not necessarily disappear. It remained embedded in practice, ritual, and place. The Sphinx stands as one such place. It holds memory without telling us what that memory is. It carries significance without explaining why. This ambiguity is not a failure. It is a characteristic of memory that predates writing. Understanding this helps shift expectations. Instead of asking what the Sphinx says, It becomes more useful to ask how it functions, how it endures, how it continues to matter despite the loss of context. Memory preserved in stone is slow. It does not hurry to communicate. It waits for those willing to notice. It survives misunderstanding because it does not depend on being understood. The Sphinx has survived because it did not require explanation to be cared for. Its presence alone justified preservation. Writing was not needed to tell people that it mattered. As the exploration continues, this idea of silent memory becomes increasingly important. It suggests that some knowledge is not meant to be recovered fully, but acknowledged as having existed. From here, attention naturally turns to what kinds of knowledge might be preserved this way. Not instructions or histories, but warnings, patterns, or reminders encoded in form rather than language. The Sphinx, carved into stone and shaped by time, may be one such reminder. Not a message written to be read, but a presence meant to persist, carrying memory forward simply by remaining. When the Sphinx is described as a monument, certain assumptions follow automatically. A monument is usually understood as a deliberate statement, erected to commemorate a person, an event, or an idea within a defined historical moment. It announces intention. It declares authorship. It fixes meaning in place. Yet the Sphinx does not behave like this kind of object. It does not proclaim. It does not explain. It does not situate itself clearly within a single narrative. Instead, it occupies space in a quieter, more enduring way, more consistent with a marker than with a monument. A marker does not need to persuade. It does not need to instruct explicitly. Its purpose is not to be read in detail, but to be recognized. Markers signal presence, boundary, return, or significance without requiring interpretation each time they are encountered. They operate through familiarity rather than explanation. In many early societies, markers were essential tools for navigating both physical landscapes and shared memory. Markers appear early in human history because they solve a simple problem. When people move through large spaces, they need fixed points that do not move with them. These points help orient movement, establish continuity, and anchor experience across time. A marker says this place matters, regardless of who is here right now. The Sphinx fits this function with remarkable precision. It is immobile, unmistakable, and inseparable from the land itself. It does not rise above the plateau. It emerges from it. Its presence is horizontal rather than vertical, emphasizing location rather than dominance. This posture is consistent with marking rather than commemoration. Unlike monuments that are meant to be seen from afar as symbols of power, the Sphinx operates at human scale despite its size. Its face meets the horizon. Its body stretches along the ground. It does not overwhelm the viewer with height. It invites encounter rather than subjugation. This quality aligns with the role of a marker, which must be accessible and legible to those who pass by. Markers also tend to outlast the context that produced them, because they are less dependent on specific meanings. A monument dedicated to a king loses relevance when that king is forgotten. A marker remains relevant as long as the place remains important. The Sphinx has survived multiple cultural transitions precisely because it does not depend on a single interpretation. This distinction helps explain why the Sphinx was never replicated. Monuments are often copied. They establish styles, forms, and programs that spread across a culture. Markers are singular. They belong to specific places. Their power comes from their uniqueness rather than their reproducibility. The Sphinx remains one of a kind, not because it was technically difficult to copy, but because copying it would defeat its purpose. The absence of inscriptions reinforces this interpretation. Monuments explain themselves. They tell you who built them and why. Markers assume you already know why the place matters. They do not need to repeat it in words. The Sphinx's silence suggests that its significance was once understood through use rather than explanation. Markers often predate writing because they serve societies that rely on memory carried through practice. In such contexts, knowledge is renewed through repeated action. A marker is not a text to be consulted once. It is a reference to be returned to repeatedly. Each return reinforces its meaning without fixing it permanently. The Sphinx's long history of burial and re-emergence fits this pattern. It disappears beneath sand and returns again, not as a rediscovered artifact but as something recognized. Each clearing is an act of acknowledgement rather than revelation. The marker resumes its role without needing to be redefined. This cycle of burial and return mirrors the rhythms of wandering and settlement discussed earlier. When movement dominates, markers remain while people come and go. When settlement increases, markers become focal points around which meaning accumulates. The Sphinx appears to have moved through both phases without losing its function. Seeing the Sphinx as a marker also clarifies its orientation. It faces outward, toward the horizon and the rising sun, not inward toward tombs or processional routes. This orientation makes sense for a structure meant to register cycles rather than ceremonies. The horizon is where day begins. It is a reference point for time rather than for ritual hierarchy. Markers are often aligned with natural cycles because these cycles structure life in pre-literate societies. The sun's movement governs seasons, migration, and return. A marker aligned with sunrise becomes a physical reminder of continuity amid change. It reinforces the sense that time itself is cyclical and dependable. The Sphinx's alignment would have functioned as a confirmation rather than a message. Each sunrise would reaffirm that the world was still operating according to known rhythms. This function does not require theology. It requires observation. Later, religious interpretations would naturally build upon this alignment. Solar symbolism fits easily onto a structure already oriented toward the sun. The marker becomes a monument only after meaning is layered onto it through theology. Its original function remains embedded in its form. The distinction between marker and monument also explains why the Sphinx lacks interior space. Monuments often contain chambers, inscriptions, or ritual areas. They are designed to be entered, used, and experienced internally. Markers are external. They work through visibility and position rather than through interior complexity. The Sphinx has no inner rooms meant for occupation or ceremony. Its significance resides entirely in its presence and placement. This design choice is consistent with marking rather than commemorating. Markers also tend to be durable, because they must endure environmental change. A marker that disappears easily fails its purpose. Carving the Sphinx into bedrock rather than assembling it from blocks ensures maximum longevity. This choice suggests concern for survival rather than display. The scale of the Sphinx reinforces this point. It is large enough to resist erosion and burial for long periods, but not so tall that it becomes structurally vulnerable. Its mass spreads horizontally, distributing stress and anchoring it firmly. This is the engineering of endurance, not of spectacle. Understanding the Sphinx as a marker also helps resolve the issue of authorship. Markers do not require authorship in the modern sense. Their authority does not come from who made them, but from how long they have been there. This explains why later Egyptians could restore the Sphinx without needing to claim its creation. Caring for a marker affirms its importance without redefining its origin. This perspective also explains why the Sphinx occupies a liminal position within the Giza complex. It is neither fully integrated into the pyramid system nor entirely separate from it. It stands at the edge, marking transition between plateau and floodplain, between earth and sky, between older and newer expressions of monumentality. Markers often occupy such thresholds. They signal entry, boundary, or passage. The Sphinx's placement at the edge of the plateau aligns with this function. It marks the point where stable ground gives way to fertile land, where permanence meets renewal. Later interpretations framed this liminality in mythic terms, associating the Sphinx with guardianship. This interpretation does not negate its role as a marker. It formalizes it within a symbolic system appropriate to a settled hierarchical society. The difference between marker and monument also affects how time interacts with the structure. Monuments age poorly because their meaning is fixed. As contexts change, they lose relevance. Markers age well because their meaning is open-ended. They adapt to new interpretations while retaining their core function. The Sphinx has aged exceptionally well in this sense. Its meaning has shifted repeatedly without erasing its presence. It has been a marker of place, a guardian, a solar symbol, a national icon, and an archaeological puzzle. Each role overlays the previous ones without replacing them. This adaptability is a hallmark of markers. They do not demand exclusive interpretation, they tolerate layering. The Sphinx's lack of narrative detail also supports this role. Monuments tell stories, markers hold space. The Sphinx does not narrate history, it witnesses it. This witnessing role aligns with its expression, which appears calm, detached, and observant rather than celebratory. Seeing the Sphinx as a marker also reframes its relationship with erosion. Weathering does not diminish a marker's function, as long as its form remains recognizable. In fact, weathering can enhance the sense of antiquity that gives a marker authority. The Sphinx's worn surfaces reinforce its role as something that has endured rather than something that was perfected. Monuments often require maintenance to preserve intended form. Markers require only survival. The Sphinx has been maintained enough to remain recognizable, but not enough to restore it to any imagined original state. This balance suggests an understanding that its power lies in endurance rather than perfection. The distinction between marker and monument also clarifies why the Sphinx feels different from other Egyptian structures. Temples and pyramids are declarative. They communicate power, order, and belief. The Sphinx communicates presence. It does not instruct. It does not command. It marks. This marking function may be why the Sphinx remains psychologically potent even today. Modern visitors often report a sense of stillness or watchfulness rather than awe. The monument does not overwhelm. It grounds. Markers ground experience. They anchor attention to place rather than to narrative. This grounding effect persists regardless of cultural background. People from vastly different traditions respond similarly to the Sphinx because its function operates at a basic human level. Understanding the Sphinx as a marker rather than a monument does not require rejecting its later symbolic roles. It places those roles within a longer continuum. The Sphinx begins as a marker and becomes a monument through reinterpretation, not through physical transformation. This sequence aligns with a broader theme of inheritance explored earlier. Early societies mark places. Later societies monumentalize them. Both processes are valid. They reflect different relationships with time and memory. The Sphinx's endurance suggests that marking preceded monumentalization in this case. Its form, placement, and silence all point toward an origin rooted in presence rather than proclamation. This perspective also softens debates about purpose. Markers do not need single purposes. They can serve multiple functions across time without contradiction. The Sphinx can be a marker of place, a guardian symbol, and a solar emblem simultaneously because its core function is to remain. As attention continues forward, this understanding opens new ways of thinking about what the Sphinx might have been marking. Not a person or event, but a relationship between land, climate, and human movement. A reminder of cycles, returns, and continuity across deep time. The Sphinx, seen this way, is not a monument waiting to be explained. It is a marker that has already done its work by staying where it is, through climates no longer remembered and cultures no longer named. From here, the exploration naturally moves toward the idea of cycles. If the Sphinx is a marker, then what it marks may not be a moment, but a pattern. Understanding that pattern requires attention, not to isolated events, but to repetition, return, and the long rhythms that shape both land and human experience. Civilizations are often described as if they move in straight lines. They rise, they flourish, they decline, and they fall, neatly arranged along timelines that give the impression of continuity even when describing collapse. Yet when viewed from a distance wide enough to include millennia rather than centuries, this linear picture begins to blur. What emerges instead is a rhythm. Periods of organisation and monument building alternate with periods of fragmentation, migration, and forgetting. Between the peaks of recorded history lie long stretches of silence, not because nothing happened, but because the forms of memory changed. These silences are uncomfortable for modern thinking. We're accustomed to written records, dates, and names. When those disappear, we tend to imagine absence. In reality, silence in the historical record often marks transition rather than emptiness. It reflects moments when societies reorganized in ways that did not leave durable textual traces. People continued to live, move, build, and adapt, but they did so without the kinds of centralized systems that produce archives. Civilization, in this broader sense, is not a continuous structure. It is a recurring condition. It appears when certain thresholds are crossed, when climate, population density, and resource stability align. It recedes when those alignments break down. The land does not reset. Humans do not vanish. What changes is the scale and form of organization. Archaeology repeatedly reveals this pattern. Layers of occupation appear separated by gaps, not because places were abandoned permanently, but because ways of life shifted. A site used intensively for centuries may then see lighter, more transient use before being reorganized again. The absence of monumental building during these intervals does not indicate regression. It indicates adaptation. These cycles are closely tied to environmental change. When conditions support surplus and stability, societies tend to concentrate. They build durable structures. They invest in permanence. When conditions become unpredictable, societies disperse. They prioritize mobility and resilience over scale. Monumentality gives way to flexibility. The Sahara's transformation from a green landscape to a desert exemplifies this process. As rainfall decreased and water sources became less reliable, population shifted toward the Nile. This concentration supported the emergence of dynastic Egypt, with its cities, temples, and written records. Before this concentration, however, people lived across a broader landscape in ways that left fewer permanent traces. The silence between civilizations is therefore not a void. It is a different mode of existence. It favours markers over monuments, memory over record, and movement over settlement. Structures built during these phases tend to be durable but minimal, designed to persist through change rather than to dominate it. The Sphinx appears to belong naturally to this in-between mode. It is too substantial to be a temporary structure, yet too silent to be a dynastic proclamation. It carries the qualities of something built to endure through transition, rather than to define a single era. If civilization operates in cycles, then the presence of a structure that spans multiple cycles becomes especially significant. Such a structure would outlast the rise and fall of organized states. It would remain when writing ceased, and remain again when writing returned. Its meaning would shift, but its presence would not. The silence surrounding the Sphinx's origin fits this pattern. It suggests that the monument may have been created during a period when civilization, as later defined, was not the dominant organizing principle. Its builders may not have seen themselves as founding something. They may have been responding to conditions marking a place, or embedding memory into the landscape without anticipating how future societies would interpret it. When dynastic Egypt emerged, it did so within a landscape already shaped by earlier cycles. The Sphinx would then appear not as a novelty, but as an inheritance from a previous organizational phase. Its presence would bridge the silence between cycles, offering continuity where written memory could not. This continuity would be especially valuable in a culture that placed such importance on order. The Egyptians understood chaos not as destruction, but as the absence of structure. Maintaining order required anchoring the present to something enduring. An ancient structure that had survived earlier upheavals would embody this principle powerfully. The silence between cycles also affects how time is perceived. Within a civilization, time is measured by reigns, events, and records. Between civilizations, time is measured by landscape and climate. Stone erodes, rivers shift, vegetation changes. These processes unfold regardless of human organization. The Sphinx, shaped by both human hands and natural forces, sits at the intersection of these two temporal scales. It records environmental time through erosion and human time through restoration. Its surface bears the marks of both, without privileging one over the other. This dual recording makes the Sphinx difficult to place within linear history. It belongs to more than one temporal system. It participates in cycles rather than in sequences. This participation helps explain why it resists definitive dating. Different aspects of the monument reflect different phases of interaction. The silence between civilizations is also where myths tend to form. When written records end, stories adapt to fill the gap. These stories are not historical accounts in the modern sense. They are frameworks for making sense of continuity amid change. They preserve meaning when detail is lost. Later myths surrounding the Sphinx may reflect this process. Rather than preserving factual origin stories, they preserve the sense that the monument was already ancient, already powerful, already connected to forces larger than any single society. This perception may be closer to the truth of its role than any specific attribution. Cycles of civilization also explain why structures like the Sphinx are rare. Most buildings are tied too closely to specific modes of organization to survive major transitions. When a civilization collapses, its infrastructure often becomes obsolete. Roads lead nowhere, cities empty. Only structures designed with endurance rather than efficiency in mind persist. The Sphinx's form prioritizes endurance. Its mass, low center of gravity, and integration with bedrock make it resistant to collapse. Its simplicity allows it to remain recognizable even when damaged. These qualities suggest an awareness of time beyond immediate use. This awareness does not require foresight in the modern sense. It can arise from lived experience of change. Societies that have already witnessed environmental shifts and organizational transitions may naturally build with endurance in mind. They know that stability is temporary. The silence between cycles can also involve the reorganization of knowledge. Skills do not vanish, they disperse. Techniques adapt to new contexts. Stoneworking, for example, may become less monumental but more mobile. Knowledge persists in practice even when it no longer produces grand structures. The Sphinx, as a remnant of an earlier monumental phase, would stand as evidence of knowledge that was once applied differently. Later societies encountering it might not replicate its construction, not because they lacked ability, but because their priorities had shifted. This helps counter the assumption that gaps in monumental building reflect loss of capability. They often reflect changes in need. When survival depends on mobility, investing in immobile structures becomes impractical. When stability returns, monumentality can re-emerge, often in new forms. The pyramids represent such a re-emergence. They appear after a long period of adaptation to a drying environment. They reflect a society that had regained enough stability to invest in permanence again. Their scale and precision signal confidence in continuity. The presence of the Sphinx alongside them complicates this narrative in a productive way. It suggests that monumentality did not begin with the pyramids. It existed earlier, receded, and then reappeared in a different form. The pyramids did not inaugurate permanence, they revived it. The silence between these phases is not a gap to be filled with speculation. It is a space to be acknowledged. It represents ways of living that do not prioritize the kinds of records we value today. Recognizing this space allows for a more nuanced understanding of human history. The Sphinx occupies that space physically. It stands where cycles overlap. It carries marks from wetter climates and from arid ones. It shows signs of early carving and later modification. It has been buried and uncovered repeatedly. Each cycle leaves its trace without erasing the previous one. This layering mirrors the layering of civilization itself. Nothing begins from nothing. Nothing ends completely. Forms change. Priorities shift. What remains adapts. The silence between civilizations also affects modern interpretation. When evidence is sparse, certainty becomes tempting. Assigning the Sphinx to a known dynasty simplifies the story. It closes the silence. Yet closure can obscure as much as it reveals. Allowing silence to remain open acknowledges the limits of historical knowledge. It respects the possibility that some phases of human organization operated differently enough that their traces do not fit neatly into later categories. This respect does not undermine archaeology. It deepens it. It encourages attention to patterns rather than isolated facts. It values environmental context alongside cultural artifacts. The Sphinx, viewed through this lens, becomes a participant in cycles rather than an exception to them. Its endurance becomes intelligible. Its ambiguity becomes expected. Civilizations rise when conditions allow. They fall or transform when conditions change. Between these states, humans continue to live, remember, and mark their world. The forms of those marks change, but the impulse remains. The Sphinx may be one expression of that impulse during a phase when writing had not yet become the primary medium of memory, and when permanence was achieved through form rather than inscription. Its survival through multiple cycles suggests that it fulfilled its role effectively. It remained meaningful enough to be preserved, adaptable enough to be reinterpreted, and durable enough to endure. The silence between civilizations is therefore not something the Sphinx contradicts. It is something the Sphinx embodies. It stands as a reminder that human history is not a continuous narrative, but a sequence of rhythms punctuated by long pauses. These pauses are not empty. They are full of life lived differently. They are full of knowledge expressed in ways that do not translate easily into texts. As attention continues forward, this understanding of cycles and silence sets the stage for a quieter, more personal question. If structures like the Sphinx persist through cycles, what are they meant to carry forward? Not stories or dates, but something more subtle. From here, the exploration naturally turns toward the idea of intention across deep time. Whether the Sphinx was meant to communicate something, or simply to remain, and what it means for us to encounter it now, standing at the edge of another transition, listening to the silence between what has been and what has yet to take shape. If Egypt found the Sphinx waiting, then the story shifts in a subtle but profound way. The monument ceases to be an expression of arrival and becomes instead an encounter. It no longer marks the moment when a civilization announced itself in stone, but the moment when a civilization recognized something that had already endured. This distinction changes not only how the Sphinx is understood, but how Egypt itself is framed within the longer human story. To find something waiting implies that time has already done part of the work. It implies that meaning was not created from nothing, but discovered, inherited, and adapted. Egypt would not begin at the Sphinx. It would gather around it. The monument would stand as a point of reference rather than a point of origin. Civilizations often like to imagine themselves as founders, but in practice they are more often stewards. They inherit landscapes shaped by earlier hands and earlier climates. They inherit paths, symbols, and places whose original purposes are no longer fully known. The act of finding something waiting requires discernment. It requires deciding how to live with what cannot be fully explained. If early Egyptians encountered the Sphinx as something already ancient, their response would reflect this dynamic. They would not need to know who carved it to understand that it mattered. Its scale, endurance, and placement would communicate authority without instruction. The monument's presence alone would demand care. This care would not be expressed through claims of authorship, but through acts of integration. Aligning the Sphinx with solar theology, associating it with kingship, and restoring it when buried would all be ways of bringing it into a new order without denying its older roots. In doing so, Egypt would not erase the past. It would anchor itself to it. Such anchoring is a common feature of emerging civilizations. When social systems reorganize rapidly, they seek continuity to stabilize change. Ancient structures provide that continuity. They offer the reassurance that the world has endured before and will endure again. The Sphinx, if found waiting, would embody this reassurance powerfully. It would appear as proof that stone, land, and form could outlast climate shifts and forgotten peoples. To build a civilization near such a structure would be to declare confidence in endurance. This perspective also reframes Egyptian innovation. The pyramids would not represent the first attempt at permanence, but the refinement of an idea already present. They would rise near the Sphinx not to replace it, but to converse with it, translating an older impulse into a new architectural language. Finding the Sphinx waiting would also influence how Egyptians understood time. Egyptian cosmology emphasized cycles, renewal, and repetition. Creation was not a singular event, but an ongoing process of maintenance against chaos. An ancient monument that had already survived cycles of change would fit seamlessly into this worldview. Rather than being a disruption, the Sphinx's antiquity would confirm Egyptian beliefs. It would demonstrate that order could persist beyond individual reigns. It would show that the land itself participated in continuity. This helps explain why the Sphinx was not dismantled or overwritten with inscriptions. Claiming it too directly would risk reducing its authority. Leaving its origin undefined allowed it to remain timeless, belonging not to a king, but to the land and the sky. If Egypt found the Sphinx waiting, then the silence surrounding its creation becomes meaningful rather than problematic. Silence would indicate distance, not neglect. It would mark the boundary between remembered history and deeper time. This boundary is where many cultures locate the sacred. What lies beyond memory often becomes mythic not because it is fictional, but because it cannot be contained within ordinary narrative. The Sphinx would occupy this threshold, existing between explanation and presence. The act of finding something waiting also implies humility. It acknowledges that not everything important was made by the current generation. It accepts that knowledge can be inherited without being fully understood. This humility contrasts with modern expectations of authorship and innovation, but it aligns closely with ancient values. Egyptian culture was not driven by novelty. It was driven by preservation of order. Innovations were often framed as restorations of an ideal past rather than as new departures. Finding the Sphinx waiting would reinforce this orientation. The past would not be behind Egypt, it would be beneath it. This beneathness is significant. The Sphinx is carved into bedrock. It is literally part of the land. Finding it waiting would mean encountering not just an object, but a feature of the landscape already imbued with meaning. It would blur the line between natural and human-made, reinforcing the idea that order arises from harmony with what already exists. If Egypt found the Sphinx waiting, then its builders would not need to ask whether they were capable of carving such a structure. They would ask how to relate to it. Capability would be secondary to relationship. This shift in emphasis resolves many of the tensions surrounding the monument. The mismatch of head and body becomes a record of adaptation rather than error. Weathering becomes evidence of long endurance rather than damage. Restoration becomes stewardship rather than correction. Finding something waiting also changes how legacy is understood. Egypt's legacy would not rest solely on what it created, but on how it cared for what it inherited. This care would itself become a defining feature of the civilization. The repeated clearing of sand around the Sphinx would then take on symbolic weight. Each clearing would reaffirm connection. It would say this still matters. even as the world changes. This act would link generations through shared responsibility rather than shared origin. This idea also reframes Egypt's relationship with memory. Writing would preserve many things, but not everything. Some things would be remembered through presence alone. The Sphinx would represent this other kind of memory, one that does not require explanation to persist. If Egypt found the Sphinx waiting, then later interpretations that treat it as a riddle or mystery reflect modern discomfort with inherited ambiguity. Ancient cultures were more comfortable living with things they did not fully explain. They valued stability over resolution. This comfort allowed them to integrate the Sphinx without needing to solve it. The monument could function as a guardian, a solar symbol, and a marker of place simultaneously. Its meaning could remain open without undermining its role. The idea of finding something waiting also introduces a temporal humility that resonates beyond Egypt. It suggests that civilizations are chapters, not authors of the entire story. They enter a world already shaped by previous chapters and leave traces for those that follow. The Sphinx, in this sense, would be less a message sent forward and more a presence carried through. It would not speak to the future intentionally. It would simply remain, allowing each era to encounter it anew. This mode of endurance is different from intentional communication. It does not require the future to understand the past. It requires only that the future recognize something has lasted. If Egypt found the Sphinx waiting, then the monument's role is not to explain an origin, but to demonstrate survival. It shows that some forms persist regardless of who claims them. This has implications for how history is approached. Instead of asking who built something first, it becomes meaningful to ask who chose to keep it. Preservation becomes as important as creation. The Sphinx has been preserved through neglect as much as through care. It survived burial. It survived erosion. It survived changing beliefs. Each survival adds to its authority. Finding something waiting also reframes how power is understood. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it resides in endurance. The Sphinx does not rule. It witnesses. This witnessing power may have been more compelling to early Egyptians than overt dominance. This witnessing quality aligns with Egyptian emphasis on balance. The gods maintained order by observing, judging, and sustaining cycles. A monument that embodied observation rather than proclamation would fit naturally into this system. The Sphinx's gaze toward the horizon reinforces this idea. It does not look inward at tombs or outward at subjects. It looks toward the rising sun, toward renewal. This orientation makes sense for a structure that marks continuity rather than authority. If Egypt found the Sphinx waiting, then its later role as a symbol of kingship becomes layered rather than original. Kings align themselves with it to borrow its authority, not to define it. This borrowing would not require deception. It would be understood as participation in a longer order. Kings did not need to invent legitimacy when they could align with something already ancient. The Sphinx's anonymity would enhance this function. Without a named builder, it could belong to everyone and no one. It could serve as a shared anchor rather than a personal monument. This shared quality may explain why the Sphinx has survived political upheavals that erased other monuments. When kings fell, their inscriptions were defaced. The Sphinx remained. It was not tied to a specific regime. Finding the Sphinx waiting also invites reflection on how civilizations define beginnings. Egypt's beginning would not be marked by the first carving of stone, but by the recognition of a place worth gathering around. This recognition would be an act of cultural maturity. It would acknowledge that civilization is not just about making, but about choosing what to preserve. The Sphinx, if found waiting, would be a test of that choice. Egypt's response suggests it passed. The monument was integrated, restored, and respected rather than ignored or destroyed. This outcome implies that the Sphinx offered something Egypt needed. Not information, but orientation. Not instruction, but grounding. As the exploration continues, this grounding becomes increasingly relevant to the present. Modern societies also inherit structures, systems, and landscapes they did not create. How they respond reflects their values. The Sphinx stands as an ancient example of what it means to encounter something already old and decide to live with it rather than replace it. It suggests that endurance itself can be a form of guidance. If Egypt found the Sphinx waiting, then the monument's greatest significance may not lie in its origin, but in its ability to bridge worlds. It connects climates, cultures, and cycles without belonging exclusively to any of them. This bridging quality allows it to remain relevant long after the civilization that adopted it has faded. It continues to wait, not passively but steadily, holding space for interpretation without demanding resolution. From this perspective, the Sphinx does not challenge Egypt's story. It deepens it. It places Egypt within a continuum rather than at a starting point. Understanding this prepares the ground for the final reflections ahead. If the Sphinx was waiting then, it may still be waiting now. Not for explanation, but for recognition of what it represents about time, memory, and human presence within a world that changes far more slowly than civilizations imagine. As attention moves toward that quieter conclusion, the focus shifts away from origins and toward implications. Not what the Sphinx was, but what it means to encounter something that has already outlasted more than one beginning. Some structures resist being understood as products of their moment. They seem to speak across time, not by delivering clear information, but by remaining present long enough to be encountered by very different worlds. This sensation does not come from complexity or ornament. It comes from endurance paired with ambiguity. When a structure survives long enough to be reinterpreted repeatedly, it begins to feel less like an artifact and more like a message, even if no one intended it to be one. This feeling arises when a structure outlives the conditions that produced it. When climate changes, cultures reorganize, and languages vanish, most human creations lose relevance. They become ruins tied to a specific past. A few, however, continue to matter. They retain presence without explanation. These are the structures that feel as though they are addressing more than one generation at once. A message across time is not the same as communication in the usual sense. It does not convey instructions or narratives. It conveys persistence. It says this has lasted. That statement alone can be powerful enough to shape how later societies understand their place in the world. The Sphinx belongs to this category because it does not depend on shared context to be meaningful. One does not need to know its origin, purpose, or builder to feel its weight. Its scale, placement, and endurance communicate something immediately without translation. It suggests that it has seen more than the viewer has lived. This quality is not unique to the Sphinx. Certain megalithic structures around the world produce similar responses. They are often simple in form, massive in scale, and closely tied to landscape. They do not explain themselves, yet they continue to command attention. Their meanings shift across cultures, but their presence remains stable. What distinguishes these structures from ordinary monuments is not mystery alone, but timing. They persist through transitions that erase other forms of memory. Writing fails, institutions collapse, belief systems change, the structure remains. When this happens, the object becomes detached from its original moment and reattached to a sequence of encounters instead. Each encounter adds a layer. Later, cultures project meaning onto the structure based on their own concerns. Over time, these projections accumulate. The structure begins to carry a sense of intention that may not reflect its origin, but reflects its survival. This is how messages across time are formed. They are not sent deliberately. They emerge from repetition. A structure that continues to be noticed, restored, and reinterpreted gradually takes on the role of a messenger simply by being there. The Sphinx exemplifies this process. It has been approached by people who lived in wetter climates, and by those who knew only desert. It has been encountered by wandering groups, by dynastic states, by empires, by modern nations. Each group has understood it differently, yet none have dismissed it as irrelevant. This continuity creates the impression that the Sphinx is addressing something fundamental rather than specific. It does not speak to kings alone, or to priests, or to tourists. It speaks to the act of encountering endurance itself. Structures that feel like messages across time often occupy liminal positions. They sit at boundaries, between land types, between orientations, between cultural zones. This placement allows them to remain relevant as borders shift. The Sphinx stands between desert and floodplain, between plateau and valley, between earth and sky. These boundaries persist even when political ones dissolve. Liminal placement ensures repeated encounter. People crossing from one zone to another notice what stands at the threshold. Over time, the threshold becomes charged with meaning. The structure becomes associated not with a single destination, but with transition itself. Messages across time also tend to avoid specificity. The more specific a structure's purpose, the more likely it is to become obsolete. A fort loses meaning when borders change. A palace loses meaning when the dynasty ends. A marker of place, cycle, or orientation remains relevant as long as the landscape remains. The Sphinx's lack of inscription contributes to this timelessness. Words fix meaning. Fixed meaning ages quickly. Silence allows reinterpretation. Each generation can read itself into the structure without contradiction. This openness can feel intentional, even if it was not. Modern observers may assume that a message was deliberately encoded, waiting to be deciphered. In reality, the message may simply be that something was worth making durable enough to survive. Durability itself becomes communication. It says that whoever shaped this stone expected change. They did not assume continuity of culture or climate. They invested effort into something that could persist without explanation. This expectation of change suggests familiarity with instability. Societies that have experienced environmental shifts or organizational collapse understand that permanence is relative. They may build not to declare dominance, but to maintain presence across uncertainty. Structures born from this mindset feel different from those built in times of confidence. They are less decorative, less explicit, more grounded. Their power comes from remaining rather than from impressing. The Sphinx reflects this grounding. Its form is simple, its posture is restrained. It does not overwhelm with complexity. It endures through mass and placement rather than through intricacy. These are the qualities of something meant to last rather than to persuade. As time passes, later societies begin to treat such structures as messages because they cannot imagine why else they would exist. The assumption of intention fills the gap left by lost context. People ask what it was meant to say rather than why it was meant to remain. This shift is understandable. Modern cultures are oriented toward communication. We expect meaning to be explicit. When confronted with something that persists without explanation, we assume there must be a hidden message. Ancient cultures may not have shared this expectation. They may have valued presence over explanation. A structure that remained visible across generations may have fulfilled its purpose simply by continuing to exist. The feeling of being addressed by such a structure arises not from content, but from contrast. The viewer recognizes their own temporariness against the object's endurance. This recognition produces reflection. In this sense, the message is not directional. It does not travel from past to future intentionally. It emerges in the present moment of encounter. Each observer receives it differently, based on their own position in time. The Sphinx has received countless interpretations because it allows them. It does not constrain meaning. It offers a surface onto which concerns about time, origin, and continuity can be projected. This projection does not diminish the monument. It activates it. Structures that feel like messages across time are those that invite reflection rather than provide answers. They prompt questions not because they hide information, but because they reveal duration. They make people aware of how little of the past is preserved and how selective survival is. The Sphinx's survival invites the question of what else once existed and did not last. Its presence implies absence elsewhere. It stands as a reminder that history is incomplete, shaped as much by what endures as by what disappears. This reminder can feel unsettling. It challenges narratives of progress and mastery. It suggests that civilizations are temporary arrangements within longer natural cycles. Structures that feel like messages across time often appear during moments when such reminders are needed. They become focal points for reflection during periods of transition. The Sphinx has repeatedly re-emerged during times of cultural change. It was restored during shifts in religious emphasis. It was rediscovered during the rise of modern archaeology. It continues to attract attention during periods of global uncertainty. Each rediscovery reframes the monument without exhausting it. The message remains open because it is not fixed. The idea of a message across time does not require intention from the original builders. It requires only that the structure be durable enough to outlast its context, and ambiguous enough to invite reinterpretation. The Sphinx meets both conditions. Its builders, whoever they were, shaped stone into a form that resisted erosion long enough to be inherited. They did not need to foresee future civilizations. They needed only to engage with time differently than those who came later. Later civilizations, encountering the Sphinx without knowing its origin, transformed its endurance into meaning. They treated it as a sign, a guardian, a symbol, a mystery. In doing so, they turned presence into message. This transformation is ongoing. Modern viewers continue the process, projecting contemporary concerns about lost knowledge, forgotten histories, and deep time onto the monument. The Sphinx absorbs these projections without being defined by them. Its form remains unchanged enough to support multiple readings. This capacity is what makes it feel communicative. Messages across time are therefore not texts waiting to be decoded. They are structures that create space for reflection. They do not tell us what to think. They remind us that others were here before, and that what we build may be judged not by what it says, but by how long it remains. The Sphinx does not deliver a warning or a lesson in words. It delivers duration. It shows that something can pass through climates, cultures, and beliefs, and still be encountered as meaningful. This kind of message is subtle. It does not demand attention. It waits for it. As attention moves toward the final reflection, this waiting becomes central. If some structures feel like messages across time, it is because they are patient enough to be encountered by those who are ready to notice them. The Sphinx may not be speaking. It may simply be allowing itself to be seen again and again, as long as people continue to arrive at its threshold with questions shaped by their own moment. From here, the final thought does not resolve the question of origin. It turns instead toward the present, toward what it means to stand before something that has already outlasted more than one civilization, and to realize that we too are only passing through. As the world grows quieter and attention begins to loosen its grip on certainty, it becomes easier to sit with a thought that does not demand resolution. Not an answer, not a conclusion, just a possibility allowed to exist without being solved. What if the Sphinx was not meant for us? Not meant for our explanations, our measurements, our timelines, or even our curiosity? What if it was never intended to speak to a future audience at all? This idea does not diminish the monument. It changes the direction of attention. Instead of asking what the Sphinx is trying to tell us, the focus shifts to why we feel compelled to listen. That shift alone can be revealing. Modern culture is oriented toward interpretation. We assume that what endures must contain a message, that survival implies intention. When something ancient resists explanation, we instinctively treat it as a riddle. We search for builders, purposes, hidden knowledge, lost instructions. We assume that meaning is something embedded deliberately and waiting to be uncovered. Yet much of what survives from the deep past survives without intention. It remains not because it was designed to communicate, but because it was designed to endure. Endurance itself becomes meaningful only when later observers encounter it from a position of distance. If the Sphinx was not meant for us, then its silence is not withholding. It is appropriate. It has nothing to explain because explanation was never its role. It existed within a context that did not anticipate our questions. The builders, whoever they were, lived within a world shaped by immediate concerns: climate, movement, survival, ritual, return. Their relationship with time would have been very different from ours. They did not need to imagine a distant future peering back at them through layers of abstraction. They needed stability in a changing landscape. They needed reference points that would persist beyond individual lives. A structure created for that purpose does not need to instruct anyone centuries later. Its success would be measured by whether it remained, not by whether it was understood. This perspective reframes the discomfort we feel when confronted with ancient ambiguity. The unease does not arise because something is missing. It arises because our expectations are mismatched. We expect communication. The past often offered presence instead. The Sphinx may belong to a category of objects that functioned fully within their original world and continue to exist beyond it without obligation to adapt. Its role may have been complete long before the first pharaoh rose to power, long before writing fixed memory into text, long before explanation became the primary mode of understanding. If that is the case, then encountering the Sphinx now is not an act of decoding. It is an act of recognition. Recognition that some things persist without reference to us. This can feel unsettling. Modern thought places humans at the centre of meaning. We assume that if something exists, it exists in relation to us, waiting to be categorized. When an object resists this framework, it challenges more than historical assumptions. It challenges the idea that everything meaningful must be legible. The Sphinx's endurance across climates and civilizations suggests a different relationship between humans and time, one in which meaning does not need to be preserved through explanation, one in which presence is sufficient. If the Sphinx was not meant for us, then its alignment with the rising sun was not a signal waiting to be interpreted. It was simply part of a lived rhythm. The sun rose. The stone faced it. Time moved forward. If the Sphinx was not meant for us, then its scale was not intended to impress distant generations. It was intended to resist erosion, burial, and forgetting within a specific environmental context. Its mass was practical as much as symbolic. If the Sphinx was not meant for us, then the absence of inscriptions is not a loss. It is fidelity to a different mode of memory, one that does not rely on language to persist. Seen this way, our questions about origin may say more about us than about the monument. We ask because we live in a culture that documents everything and trusts permanence only when it is narrated. The Sphinx comes from a time when permanence was achieved through form, placement, and repetition rather than through record. There is a quiet humility in accepting that some things are not addressed to us. It does not diminish our capacity to appreciate them. It deepens it. Appreciation becomes less about possession of knowledge and more about presence. Standing before the Sphinx, physically or imaginatively, we encounter something that has already outlasted more than one way of being human. It existed before centralized power, before writing, before fixed borders. It endured through the rise of a civilization that would later define much of how history is told. It continued through that civilization's decline. It remained through conquest, reinterpretation, neglect, restoration, and modern rediscovery. At no point did it need to change in order to be encountered again. This persistence suggests that the Sphinx does not belong to any one audience. It is not a message sent forward. It is a form that continues to be encountered because it continues to exist. If it was not meant for us, then our role is not to solve it, but to notice what it reveals about time, about how little of the past survives, about how much of human experience leaves no durable trace, about how rare it is for something to remain recognizable across such vast change. The Sphinx may not be asking us to remember who built it. It may be reminding us that memory itself is fragile, selective, and contingent. That what survives does so not because it explains itself, but because it was built in a way that allowed it to outlast explanation. This realization can feel strangely calming. It releases the pressure to extract meaning. It allows the monument to exist without being exhausted by interpretation. There is a tendency, especially in modern discourse, to treat ancient structures as puzzles that must eventually be solved. Dates will be refined, attributions will be debated, theories will rise and fall. This process is valuable, but it is not the only way to relate to the past. Another way is to accept that some structures operate outside the cycle of question and answer. They remain relevant not because they yield information, but because they provoke awareness. Awareness of scale, of duration, of the narrowness of individual lifetimes compared to the breadth of human presence. If the Sphinx was not meant for us, then its greatest significance may lie in its indifference. It does not respond to attention. It does not change when studied. It does not confirm or deny theories. It remains what it has been, regardless of who is looking. This indifference can feel like distance, but it can also feel like steadiness. In a world defined by constant change, something that remains without explanation offers a different kind of anchor. Ancient societies may have understood this instinctively. They did not need to know everything about a structure to respect it. Respect came from recognition of endurance. Later Egyptians restored the Sphinx not because they knew its origin, but because they recognized its place within the landscape and within time. That recognition was enough. Modern observers often struggle with this idea. We seek clarity where ancient cultures accepted ambiguity. We seek authorship where they valued continuity. If the Sphinx was not meant for us, then perhaps our task is not to force it into our frameworks, but to allow it to challenge them, to accept that some knowledge is not recoverable because it was never meant to be transferred across millennia in the form we expect, to accept that some meanings are local to their time and complete within it. This acceptance does not diminish the monument's significance, it preserves it. There is also something quietly reassuring in the thought that the Sphinx does not depend on our understanding to continue existing. It survived long before modern scholarship and will likely persist long after current debates have faded. Our encounter with it is brief in comparison. We stand before it for a moment, ask our questions and move on. The stone remains. This perspective can soften the urgency often associated with ancient mysteries. Not everything needs to be solved to be meaningful. Not everything lost needs to be recovered to matter. The Sphinx may be one of those rare things that invites contemplation without demanding conclusion. It offers a pause rather than an answer. As this thought settles, it becomes possible to see the monument not as a challenge to modern knowledge, but as a reminder of its limits. A reminder that human history is vast, layered, and incomplete. That what we know is always partial. There is comfort in this incompleteness. It leaves room for humility. It leaves room for wonder that does not seek to conquer its object. If the Sphinx was not meant for us, then our encounter with it becomes less about ownership of the past and more about participation in a longer continuum of attention. We are one of many audiences, not the final one. Others stood before it without knowing who built it. Others restored it without knowing why it was first carved. Others imagined meanings that made sense within their own time. We do the same. The difference is that we often believe our questions are more definitive, that we are closer to answers because we have more tools. Yet tools do not eliminate distance. They change how distance is experienced. The Sphinx's endurance suggests that distance itself may be part of its function. It remains far enough removed to resist final interpretation, close enough to remain present. As this quiet thought unfolds, there is no need to decide what the Sphinx was meant to be. It is enough to consider that it may have already fulfilled its purpose long ago, within a world shaped by different rhythms and expectations. Our role is not to complete that purpose, it is simply to encounter what remains. And perhaps that is the most restful idea of all, that some things do not wait to be understood, they wait only to be there. As attention drifts and the mind slows, the Sphinx can be allowed to return to stillness. Not as a question, not as a symbol, but as a presence that has already endured more than explanation. If it was not meant for us, that does not exclude us. It places us gently within a much larger story, one in which we are passing through, noticing briefly what has already learned how to remain. And in that recognition, there is nothing to solve, nothing to conclude, only the quiet awareness of time moving forward as it always has, while the stone keeps its place, waiting without expectation, long after our thoughts have grown silent,